Welcome to the show, everyone. You're listening to the Dance of Life podcast, and I'm your host, as always, Tudor Alexander. Today, hopefully, will be very edifying for you and strengthen your mind for the coming delusion that is coming not only upon America, but upon the entire world. And of course, that delusion is the Catholic social teaching New World Order scheme that we've talked about quite a bit on this channel. I've talked about it in my End Times series, my Venerable Day of the Sun news updates, my Synagogue of Satan series, my Great Delusion series, my series on the papacy, Dominum Deum Nostrum Papam, that's Latin for Our Lord God the Pope, and pretty much anything under the eschatology section bracket of the Bible Studies page. So if you are new and all of the things that we're talking about today are super overwhelming, don't worry, there's plenty of help. Make sure you go to the Bible Studies page and take it one step at a time. Nevertheless, today you have a concerted and consistent effort by the agents of the beast to shape culture in America and around the world, but specifically in America and in a very specific direction. Trump has fulfilled his role in destroying American politics, destroying Protestantism, and of course, exposing the Jews. As a result, there is a synthesis happening right now. If you've caught it, hopefully, in the last couple months, we've been really talking about it, especially this year in 2026. There's a synthesis happening between right and left and away from Protestantism and also away from traditional Americanism, which is by and large secular for the most part, into what? Into Catholicism, into Catholic social teaching values. We are at a major inflection point, folks. Today you will understand the gravitas, the weight of that inflection point. Hopefully you will. Nevertheless, the right is becoming more more concerned with social justice. The left is becoming more religious and concerned with objective morality because they were very subjective before. And the right, in its off-balanced position, which it's been all by design, but in its off-balance position, the right was very much not concerned with social justice and social problems. And these things are being repaired as the destruction of the political system is taking its full weight on the public. And this is exactly the formula for Catholic social teaching. It's a narrow road, so to speak, between these two extremes that incorporates conservatism with social justice. You have simultaneously at the same time that this is rising, you also have superstars, Catholic superstars that are shaping culture, like Joe Kent, like Carrie Prejean Bowler, and so many others that are taking the stage to stand up for the truth and to show people what true Americanism is like, what true patriotism is like, what really being for we the people is like. And of course, Joe Kent, probably a made-up name between G.I. Joe and Clark Kent, typical psyop. These things are all designed, folks, to change your perspective of what direction you should go as a country, as a society. And of course, that direction was predicted by the Bible a long time ago. But the Pope is being hailed as the hero to come rescue people from Trump, from the Trump administration. Catholics are being painted as the reasonable ones that are not just tolerant, but not bloodthirsty like the Protestants, which are being painted as bloodthirsty, intolerant, maniacs. Apologists, Catholic apologists, are using historical revisionism to paint a rosy-colored picture of America's past as a quote-unquote Christian nation, and of course as Catholicism as a huge, major positive contributor to American history, which of course is not true. You will learn that today, but nevertheless, this is what they do with the early church. They backdate Catholicism beyond the 4th century. And they create this rosy-colored picture of Peter being the first pope and passing that succession through time, this entire fakery that doesn't exist, in order to justify its existence. Because otherwise, if it can't justify its existence, then you recognize it as something that is evil and wicked, that is not the will of God. So in the same way, they do the same kind of historical revisionism with America. Now, the great irony that people will not realize in this entire scheme is that a loyal Catholic cannot be a patriot, my friends. I hope one thing that you can take from today, because there's going to be a lot of things we're talking about today. I have, I don't know, I think like 30 pages of notes to go through. So this presentation will probably be on the longer end. It'll be a great resource for you. Nevertheless, one thing that you can take, hopefully, a very simple idea that you can take to the bank and in your conversations, is that a loyal Catholic cannot be a true patriot. Why? Because Catholicism is an empire, folks. Catholicism is an empire. It's the fifth and final empire of Daniel 2 and the continuation of Satan's schemes in the church age. It has a God king, the papacy, and it has political agents like the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, the cardinals, the various orders, the priests. These are all political agents that are loyal to a God king, operating as a state within a state. It has its own territory that's sovereign, which is the Vatican. And all loyal Catholics must be loyal to the papacy, up and over and against any temporal power. Therefore, a loyal Catholic, especially one that is in an order like the Knights of Malta or whatever, Jesuits, cardinals, higher up in the ranks, not just a lay person, especially those people, but in general, but especially those people, cannot be considered true patriots. They cannot. So if somebody is in government and they are a Knight of Malta or whatever, or a cardinal and they're doing various things with political figures, you cannot trust that situation. That's not just an innocent priestly situation. You know, being part of a Knight of Malta or whatever other order there's so many of them. That's the one a lot of people know about. But there's so many. Being parts of these orders or being knighted, as you will see many examples, these aren't just like formalities, okay? These are acknowledgments and initiations, and these are people that are part of a club. And thank God that you're not in that club. So this is why the Founding Fathers discouraged people from converting to Catholicism and disparaged Catholicism in general and papism, popery, and the Jesuits, and they wanted nothing to do with them. And there's plenty of quotes from them. We'll look at one of them between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams today, because they understood these simple truths that I just relayed to you, that a true Catholic, cannot be a loyal patriot to a country, because their loyalty has to be to the Pope. However, today, 250 years later, Catholics seem like the reasonable ones, Catholics seem like the true patriots, and Catholics seem like the ones that are tolerant, whereas the Protestants seem like they are unreasonable, totally unpatriotic, and bloodthirsty. All by design, folks. Protestantism is dead. And in the next 5 years, you are going to see a Catholic resurrected Hollywood, as it was in the beginning, a Catholic conservative echo chamber, which we already have, a Catholic president and a Catholic cabinet, which most of the cabinet currently is Catholic, a Catholic Supreme Court, most of that is already Catholic today, a Catholic majority over the evangelical majority. Currently, it's about 20% Catholic to 23% evangelical. I think that's going to change pretty drastically in the next 5 years. And of course, last but not least, certainly we can't forget the American Pope. All of these stars will be aligned, my friends, in the next 5 years, give or take. You know, I don't have a crystal ball, but just doing educated guessing and, planning forward, I think that you'll see all of these things intersect very soon. Now, all of that culture shaping and destruction that you see right now is by design. And it's going to be right on time for a total Catholic takeover. The collapse of the political system, the exposing of the Jews, the complete extremes that they have been on both sides. All of this is by design so that reality that I just painted to you, where all the stars align and America becomes Catholic dominated, that is going to happen because the world will marvel after the beast, and the Bible predicted these things. That's why today's episode is called Independence Day. Little play on words there, if you caught it, hopefully. It's a play on words to reveal how far we've come from independence. We've gone from independence to independence. And, of course, the dependence is on the beast. In the meantime, until that final reality where the beast is marveled after, you're going to see an increasing amount of propaganda. And that propaganda is what I'm trying to get ahead of with this presentation, so that you have tools and resources to be able to fight it, because you're going to see a lot of propaganda. That propaganda is going to be to reframe the American landscape, to reframe American politics into the Catholic image with all of the things I just mentioned: historical revisionism, rosy-colored narratives, apologetics, yada, yada, yada narratives, Catholic social teaching, etc., etc. You're going to see massive amounts of propaganda, especially as everything else collapses. So you have to be ready for these things in your own circles, in your own battles. And today we'll arm you with that information like a tank. So anyway, make sure you subscribe, like, leave a comment of what you learn, hopefully something positive, and you can encourage each other and share these things with others too, because people need to learn the truth. There's so many people that do not have an understanding of even like 1% of what I'm talking about today. 1%. And that's not even, I'm not even trying to be hyperbolic. I genuinely believe from what I've seen on the internet that very few people understand these things. That's why I've done all of this work to put it all in one place so that you have a resource. And of course, if you have any questions, you can ask Fennec. He's my premier chatbot that is trained on all of my content, including today's episode. So you can ask him to reference things for you. Very, very useful, especially when you're trying to find something, of course, in the mountains and mountains of research that I've put together, 1,000+ hours of videos. So there's a lot in there, and he's a great tool that is a companion for the library. If you want to support me, you can just go to the website, be a paid member, $5 a month, $50 a year. You can check out the store, or you can donate anything that you feel called to do. Now, important announcements. There's some big releases that have recently happened. So if you haven't checked those out, then make sure that you go and do that. They are very valuable to your journey. That's the 4th volume of the Bible Studies books. I don't have it with me. It's a big volume, 800 pages, orange, to complement a multicolored library and stack. Probably it's going to be my last 800-page Bible study volume. We'll see. I don't see any more major studies coming after this point. I really have done quite a lot of work. I mean, I think 4 volumes of 800 pages, 3,200 pages worth of Bible studies is plenty. So make sure you grab yours. It's full of all the major studies that I've done in 2026 and a lot of discussion questions that are not in the Berean Q&A. Also, the 7 Transformations, which is my magnum opus theology book. That's going to be going on as far as audio recordings every Friday, at least until 2027. And pretty much if you want to take my entire 1,000-hour library and condense it into a book that defends all of my positions into one consistent systematic theology, that's the book for you. And all the recordings are free. You can listen to the audiobook free online in the Bible Studies page. Excuse me. But you can also get the book in the store. There's also a poster, an art poster that kind of highlights all the main lessons of the book on there with a QR code. So it's pretty cool. And of course, the updated USB, which is updated by over 100-something hours of content. Of course, all of the things that were done in 2026 that had to be added to the library. And now it comes in 2 flavors. It comes in Classic, which is the black label, or the Matrix flavor, which is pretty cool too. So whichever one you feel like getting. But that's the updated USB. Make sure you check out my post on that, because that is now available. So the presentation notes for this particular study will also be on the USB and the Bible Studies Volume 4. Today we're going to go through about 500 years of history and see exactly what Catholicism has contributed to American history. Because the Bible says America's role is to deceive the nations, to be the false prophet that deceives the nations into ultimately worshiping the beast, which means it will help the papacy resurrect, and it will help people enter into a religious system that pays honor and worship to this power. So today is going to be a masterclass on true American history for you. So make sure you bookmark this. Make sure that you have a notebook. Make sure that you take notes and you help others who are stuck in political psyops. That means that what we can see, if this is the truth, then what we can see is the opposite of what the Catholic apologists are telling us. They will always paint a more rosy narrative and omit very important history, as usual, when in fact the reality that is actually present in history is we see a consistent and concerted effort by Catholic interests to subjugate America, to take it over, and to turn it into a vassal state for the Pope. And today you will see exactly that's true, because that subversion, as of today, the 250th anniversary will be in a few days, but as of today, that subversion is practically complete, and America is ready to be that vassal state. All that needs to happen is just all those little culture-shaping moments to align all the stars that I mentioned previously, and the United States will be ready, and it will be ready to perform its final act of obedience to the papacy, which is to deceive the world, just as Scripture prophesied. So with that, let's begin with the Spanish. The Spanish are an important place to begin, because Catholics love to talk about how they helped to colonize and reform the Americas and do all these wonderful things with their missions. But of course, history is very nuanced, and Catholic apologists are notorious for omitting the ugly parts of history when it comes to Catholicism. So let's take a look at some of those ugly parts. This is an article from Times of Israel about Christopher Columbus, and it sets a very important precedent, so pay attention. Study finds Christopher Columbus was a Sephardic Jew from Western Europe. The 15th century explorer Christopher Columbus was a Sephardic Jew from Western Europe, Spanish scientists said on Saturday, after using DNA analysis to tackle a centuries-old mystery. Now, this is dated 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, October 2024. Several countries have argued over the origins and final burial place of the divisive figure who led Spanish-funded expeditions from the 1490s onward, opening the way for the European conquest of the Americas. Many historians have questioned the traditional theory that Columbus came from Genoa, Italy. Other theories range from him being a Spanish Jew or Greek to Basque, Portuguese, or British. Who is this mysterious Christopher Columbus? To solve the mystery, researchers conducted a 22-year investigation led by forensic expert Miguel Lorente by testing tiny samples of remains buried in Seville Cathedral, long marked by authorities there as the last resting place of Columbus, though there had been rival claims. They compared them with those of known relatives and descendants, and their findings were announced in a documentary titled Columbus DNA, The True Origin on Spain's national broadcast TVE on Saturday. We have DNA from Christopher Columbus, very partial but sufficient. We have DNA from Hernando Colon, his son, Lorente said in the program. And both in the Y chromosome, male, and the mitochondrial DNA transmitted by the mother of Hernando, there are traits compatible with Jewish origin. Around 300,000 Jews lived in Spain before the Reyes Católicos, where Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand ordered Jews and Muslims to convert to the Catholic faith or leave the country. The word Sephardic comes from Sepharad, or Spain in Hebrew. In 1492, Edict of Expulsion in Spain forced Sephardic Jews to convert to Christianity or leave, prompting a dispersion to locations including the Americas and the Middle East. Within Spain and its newfound American colonies, some conversos, or Jewish converts, kept their original faith in secret, under threat of discovery and punishment from the Inquisition. Such an interesting bit of history, don't you think? Let's see. Crypto-Judaism is the secretive adherence to Judaism while publicly professing to be of another faith. If practitioners referred to as crypto-Jews, the term is especially applied historically to Spanish and Portuguese Jews who outwardly professed Catholicism, also known as conversos, moranos, and the anusim. The phenomenon is especially associated with medieval Spain, following the massacre of 1391 and the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. After 1492 in Spain and 1497 in Portugal, officially they no longer existed. The Spanish Inquisition and the Portuguese Inquisition were established to monitor converted Jews and Muslims and their descendants for their continued adherence to Christian faith and practice, with severe penalties for those convicted of secretly continuing to practice their original beliefs. This would have involved the Inquisition paying close attention to the households of suspected converted Jews, since most of the families still practicing Judaism would have done so through the food. Information about secretly observant Jews largely survives in Inquisition cases against the individuals. Now, very interesting that you understand that this is also a nuanced point. For example, Bibi Netanyahu's father, I believe he was a professor, he wrote a book on the Inquisition and how a lot of these Jews really enjoyed their new Catholic faith. So Very interesting times. Court Jew is another important thing you need to be aware of. Court Jew was a term used in early modern period Europe, particularly Germany, for Jewish moneylenders who lent to or managed money for the upper classes in return for social privileges. So, conclusion. I start with Columbus because it sets an important precedent. Columbus was a papal court Jew doing the bidding of the beast and being put in front so that if anything goes awry, the Jew takes the blame, as usual. Please watch my video, Rome and Judea Are United Against Christ, because it sets a very important precedent for how these two threads have united over time, because history is very nuanced. Just as Rome and the Jews crucified Jesus physically in history, Rome and Judea as systems are always against and crucifying the body of Christ throughout the church age, because that is the structure of the Antichrist power. However, out of those two threads, remember that Satan gave his throne and power to Rome, to the beast, not to Judea. So remember, this is all just propaganda when it comes to all the Jew baiting that is being propagated into culture right now, because the Jews don't own the world, folks. In all the 2,000 years of church history, the Jews were just a bunch of ragtag people. They were put in ghettos. They were labeled. They were ostracized. People hated the Jews. Some of them got privileges from the monarchs, but they were papal court Jews. They were jesters. That's the court Jew. There's never a time when a Jew would have ever come into a position of power like the Roman family. So you have to really know your history. Nevertheless, you are going to see these things in American history with all the exposing of the Zionist system, the dispensationalism, everything that's already taking place right now. So you have to understand this very important precedent. Now, let's talk about the Spanish Conquests. This is the Taino genocide. The Taino genocide was committed against the Taino indigenous people by the Spanish during their colonization of the Caribbean during the 16th century. The population of the Taino before the arrival of the Spanish Empire on the island of Quisqueya, or Haiti, in 1492, which Christopher Columbus named Hispaniola, which is present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. That population is estimated to be between 10,000 and 1 million. Following the deposition of the last Taino chief in 1504, the Spanish began subjecting the local population to slavery, massacres, and other forms of violence. By 1514, the Taino population had reportedly been reduced to about 32,000 people. By 1565, to 200. And by 1802, they were officially declared extinct by Spanish colonial authorities. However, mixed race and other Taino descendants continue to live, and their disappearance from records may be more the result of colonial classification practices rather than evidence of true extinction. I'm sure they probably survived to some degree by intermarrying, because that's just a pretty common thing. But let's take a look at some more. This is the Cholula Massacre. The massacre of Cholula wasn't too bad because I really like Cholula sauce, hot sauce. I love Cholula hot sauce. The massacre of Cholula was an attack carried out by the military forces of the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés on his way to the city of Mexico, Tenochtitlan, in 1519. Francisco López de Gomarra indicates that the massacre of Cholula began after Cortés captured and killed Cholulteca leaders, unleashing with this act the slaughter of 6,000 people in less than 2 hours. Leave it to the Catholics, man. They're great at that kind of stuff. According to his letters of relationships, Cortés affirms that he made this decision as a preventative action before a possible ambush by 20,000 Mexica soldiers. However, the accounts collected by Bernardino de Sahagún contradict this version, since it is narrated that only unarmed Cholultec civilians were killed. Oh, goodness. Nothing new under the sun, huh? Just like modern-day Iran and everywhere else. There's terrorists! There's terrorists! And the terrorists end up being just women and children. Massacre in the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan. The massacre in the Great Temple, also called the Tuxcatl Massacre or the Alvarado Massacre, was an event on May 22nd, 1520, in the Mexica, also known as the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, during the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, in which the celebration of the feast of Tuxcatl ended in a massacre of Mexica elites. In late April of 1520, Cuban governor Diego Velázquez de Cuellar ordered Spanish conquistador Panfilo de Narvaez to arrest Hernán Cortés while he was in Tenochtitlan. Cortés heard about Narvaez coming from Cuba, so he had some of his army left the city of Tenochtitlan to fight them. Before he departed, he entrusted one of his captains, Pedro de Alvarado, with governing both the Spanish and Mexica. During his absence, the Mexica Emperor Moctezuma, also known as Montezuma, asked Alvarado for permission to celebrate the festival of Toxcatl, a Mexican festivity in honor of Tezcatlipoca, one of their main gods. Moctezuma had previously gotten authorization to celebrate the festival of Toxcatl from Cortés. However, Alvarado suspected that the Mexica were using Toxcatl as cover for a rebellion against the Spaniards. After the festivities had started, Alvarado turned on the Mexica, killing performers, spectators, and nobles celebrating inside Tenochtitlan's great temple. According to Mexica accounts, the Spanish blocked all exits and charged furiously at the celebrants, killing indiscriminately. Spanish accounts of the massacre suggest several possible incitements, some saying the Mexica wanted to reclaim the gold of the Spaniards had taken, and others blaming Narvaez for causing Cortez's abrupt departure. The Mexica also say that the Spaniards openly coveted the gold that the Mexica were wearing, prompting a Mexica rebellion against the orders of Moctezuma. Although Alvarado's motive was debated, all accounts agree that the Mexica at that feast were mostly unarmed and the massacre was not directly provoked and occurred with no warning. There were already tensions between the Mexica and occupying Spaniards who were holding Moctezuma prisoner. When Cortés and his men returned, the Mexica drove the Spaniards out of the city on the so-called sad night, La Noche Triste, losing most of their men in battle or as prisoners who were then sacrificed. Quite a bloody history, don't you think? Let's see, what else do we got here? The Acoma Massacre, 1599. The Acoma Massacre was a punitive expedition by the Spanish conquistadors at Acoma Pueblo in January 1599. Around 500 Acoma men and 300 women and children were killed during the 3-day onslaught. Of the Acoma survived the attack, many were sentenced to 20-year terms of bondage and 24 suffered amputations. The massacre was the result of the battle between the Spanish colonizers and Native Americans from the Caras Acoma Nation in what is now New Mexico, in retaliation for the killing of 12 Spanish soldiers by the Acoma in the previous year. So you killed 12 of us, we're going to massacre 800 of you, and especially women and children. This is the encomienda. That's right, the encomienda is very important also. The encomienda was a 16th century Spanish labor system that rewarded Spain's conquistadors with the labor of conquered non-Christian peoples. In theory, the conquerors provided the laborers with benefits, including military protection and education, quote-unquote education. In practice, the conquered were subject to conditions that closely resembled instances of forced labor and slavery. What is that? It doesn't look like protests. What was that meme that was like a couple years ago? Mostly peaceful protests. The encomienda was first established in Spain following the Christian Reconquista, and it was applied on a much larger scale during the Spanish colonization of the Americas. In the Spanish East Indies, conquered peoples were considered vassals of the Spanish monarch. The crown awarded an encomienda as a grant to a particular individual. In the conquest era of the early 16th century, the grants were considered a monopoly on the labor of particular groups of indigenous peoples, held in perpetuity by the grant holder, called the encomendero. Starting from the new laws of 1542, the encomienda ended upon the death of the encomendero, and was replaced by the repartimiento. Encomiendas devolved from their original Iberian form into a form of communal slavery. In the encomienda, the Spanish crown granted a person a specified number of natives from a specific community, but did not dictate which individuals in the community would have to provide their labor. Indigenous leaders were charged with mobilizing the assessed tribute and labor. In turn, encomenderos were to ensure that the encomienda natives were given instruction in Catholicism and the Spanish language, to protect them from warring tribes or pirates, to suppress rebellion against Spaniards, and maintain infrastructure. The natives provided tributes in the form of metals, maize, wheat, pork, and other agricultural products. Now, remember all of this when we come back to the Jesuit reductions in South America, because these things are always going to be denied by Catholic apologists. And I think that was it for that one. Now, we still have one more, and that is the Spanish requirement of 1513. The Spanish requirement of 1513, requerimento, was a declaration by the Spanish monarchy of Castile's divinely ordained right to take possession of the territories of the New World and to subjugate, exploit, and, when necessary, to fight, in parentheses, and kill the native inhabitants. The declaration was written by Juan López de Palacios Rubios, jurist of the Council of Castile, and made on behalf of Ferdinand II of Aragon and his daughter, the Queen Regnant Joanna of Castile. The requerimento, Spanish for requirement, as in demand, was read to natives. It was read to natives to inform them of Spain's rights to conquest. The Spaniards thus considered those who resisted as defying God's plan, and so used Catholic theology to justify their conquest. So let's paint this picture very clearly. They would arrive in these territories. They would come out with their little scroll. They would read it and proclaim the scroll in Spanish. And of course, the natives are sitting there scratching their heads. And they're proclaiming that this is God's will, that we've conquered these lands. And if you resist, you're resisting God's will. And we have the right to kill you. And of course, the natives couldn't understand a word. So what happened? They got killed. So that's the requirement of the Catholic Spanish Empire. So conclusion from just this little bit. Historical estimates vary, but probably up to something like 90 million or maybe even 100 million Indians died from the Spanish conquests. A lot of this, of course, was from the diseases that the Spaniards brought, which the natives did not experience, and so they died because of plagues. But there were also countless war crimes and subjugations and all sorts of naughty things. These things that I shared with you are just a sample. There are so many, and people have written books about that. And of course, how many more are untold and unknown about. The Spanish killed them indiscriminately, like animals. They pillaged their goods. They enslaved them, all in the name of God. They read them a proclamation demanding obedience to the papacy and to the crown, and of course, a language that they did not understand, as a way to justify destroying them when they rebelled. They entrapped them in debt slavery systems with indenturing contracts and quote-unquote benefits, when in fact they're just really putting them in a debt slave system. And they abused wherever they could because these people were like second-class human beings to them. Remember this kind of history when the Roman Catholic Church wants to present itself as the reasonable and tolerant one who cares about your freedom of conscience, who cares even about social justice. Remember that, because history testifies very clearly against the Catholic Church. This whole Catholic social teaching thing is just a shield. It's a way to put the poor, the family, social justice, all of these things that people want, the weaknesses of society, to put that forward and say, look, we care about these things. We care about freedom of speech. We care about freedom of conscience, which of course is not true whatsoever. Now, is it true that these Spaniards were doing the will of God? In some sense, yes. So we have to have a biblical approach here with God's sovereignty, because they were doing the will of God. Not in the way that they were claiming to, but God was judging these Indians for all of their wicked practices, their idolatry, their human sacrifices, all sorts of ugly practices. So yes, they were being judged. However, what's the pattern of history, my friends? God raises up a wicked power to judge another wicked power. So God gave the Indians into the Spaniards' hands as a judgment for centuries and centuries of human sacrifice and all sorts of idolatry, worshiping Satan. So yes, they got what was coming to them. However, that doesn't exonerate the power doing the judging. Babylon judged the Israelites, but Babylon itself was judged brutally because they were wicked. So the power that judged the Indians was doing God's will in some sense, not in the way that they were believing it to be, in the sense that they believed that they had God's approval and they were innocent and they were the righteous ones, which of course is not true. They're wicked. But God was giving that judgment into their hands as justice for all of the idolatry and wickedness of the Indians. So nevertheless, we have to remember that just because that they were exercising judgment on these people, that it doesn't exonerate them, because this system is going to be judged itself by God when he returns. Now, let's talk about the Jesuit reductions. This is a book called The Hispanic American Historical Review, November 1966. And if I can find... Okay, so yeah, this thing was glitching out because the Zoom... It doesn't like the Zoom level, so anyway, I was hiding it. But this is a little section I want to talk to you about the reductions, the Jesuit reductions, which were little colonies that the Jesuits set up in the name of helping the people and Christianizing them and so on and so forth, but history says a different story. This is just an excerpt from this book. Research scholarship takes a position more closely approximating the views of Palafox, which were communicating by him to Pope Innocent X. Now, really quick point. Palafox was I think his name was Felix or something. Palafox was a bishop in that area in Latin America that was complaining about the Jesuit reductions. And he documented, why this is useful is he's documenting all of the gains that they're making. And he's complaining basically like, hey, he wrote a letter to the Pope saying these guys aren't paying any tithe. They're not paying their 10% or whatever to the church. They're just keeping it all. Look how much they have. So he's revealing to you the extent of this empire that they were building in Latin America, which were communicated to him by Pope Innocent. Palafox saw the bishop's situation in Puebla as untenable. He found that the Jesuits possessed a great deal of landed wealth, which was exempt from taxation. 2 of the colleges had 300,000 sheep, he claimed, not counting some of the smaller flocks. He noted that although all the cathedral churches and all other religious orders taken together had no more than 3 sugar refineries, the Society of the Jesuits had 6 of the largest in the diocese. One of those, he said, was worth 500,000 thalers. Further, the income from these refineries gained for the Jesuits an income of 300,000 pesos per year. He was concerned that the wealth of the order, which was invested not only in land and cattle, but also in silver mines, would eventually reduce their secular clergy to the same level as their sacristans, and even force other religious to beg at the Jesuit doors. He believed that their wealth was becoming a source of discord. All this property would have made a sovereign powerful, he thought, but under the circumstances this land served no purpose other than to maintain 10 colleges, none of them very large either in student body or in faculty. Nevertheless, Palafox praised the order in a backhanded way, conceding that the Jesuits made good use of their skill to increase what he felt was their superabundant wealth. In addition to the haciendas, he reported that they had public warehouses, shops, and granaries. Writing to the Jesuit father Horacio Caroche at the height of the struggle, he also praised the order and the good which it had accomplished for the faith. But he included yet another list which showed that the order was far too wealthy, and he argued that it ought to be required to pay the 10th. He pointed out to Father Caroche that the College of Saints Peter and Paul and the novitiate at Tepozotlan had more than 70,000 head of cattle, at Tepaca 17,000 head of cattle. At Tecomate they had 16,000 head of sheep. The College of Tepozotlan had 14,000 wethers and 12,000 lambs, he said. This was a vast base support to the Jesuits. This was a vast base to support so few Jesuits, who in 1648 totaled only about 400 priests and brothers. Palafox further warned Caroche that the Mexican Council had forbidden the clergy to have grocery stores, slaughterhouses, and meat markets. So, another source for you is the suppression of the Society of Jesus, and we'll talk about it now in just a second. The suppression of the Society of Jesus was the removal of all members of the Jesuits from most Western Europe and their respective colonies beginning in 1759. Along with the abolition of the Order of the Holy See in 1773, the papacy acceded to anti-Jesuit demands without much resistance. The Jesuits were serially expelled from the Portuguese Empire, from France, from the Kingdom of Naples, from the Kingdom of Sicily, Malta, Duchy of Parma and Piacenza, and the Spanish Empire and Austria and Hungary. They were expelled from everywhere. I wonder why. I really, truly wonder why. They're such nice, priestly men, right? Historians identify multiple factors causing the suppression. The Jesuits, who were not above getting involved in politics, were distrusted for their closeness to the Pope and his power, an independent nation's religious and political affairs. In France, it was a combination of many influences, from Jansenism to free thought, to then prevailing impatience with the ancien regime. Monarchies attempting to centralize and secularize power viewed the Jesuits as supranational, too strongly allied to the papacy and too autonomous from the monarchs in whose territory they operated. This is a extremely whitewashed way to put why they were expelled from these countries. Extremely whitewashed. When they were involved in inciting so many assassinations and revolutions, and they had their confessionals in every king's court, and they knew everything that everybody was doing. They had the original intelligence network through their confessionals. That's a very whitewashed way to put it. But nevertheless, they were expelled. So what can we take from these important lessons? The Jesuit reductions were colonies that the Jesuits had set up in South America, especially with the Guarani Indians, and basically they operated these things as Catholic communism, as a theocratic government. Wikipedia, of course, is going to be extremely whitewashed on these topics, but there are many books that detail how these things actually play themselves out. I gave you a quote from Palafox to show you the magnitude of the government that they were setting up. And of course, you also saw from the Spanish Conquistadors the practices that they were doing. It's all the same, folks. They were subjugating the crap out of these people. If you want more, go watch my Synagogue of Satan series, especially the chapter on communism. The Jesuits were like demigods to these poor Indians. They were viewed as demigods. And the Indians, of course, were treated like second-class citizens. They had everything in common. They had to surrender all of their property and all of the fruits of their labor given to the Jesuits, and the Jesuits would apportion to everyone as they saw fit. And of course, they kept most of it. And they convinced the Guarani Indians that this is the will of God, and just keep doing it. The Jesuits made probably billions in today's money off of that operation, as is testified by Palafox and others who saw their immense wealth. That wealth eventually made its way to the monarch's ears, and they realized, wait a minute, what are these people doing? These people are building an empire of their own will. This is going to be a huge problem, especially with everything we know about the Jesuits. So this led to the Jesuit suppression, and the Pope at that time went along, and of course he paid the price. He got killed. He got poisoned, which you aren't going to find on Wikipedia, but he was poisoned. And when they were reinstated, the papacy understood, okay, we can play ball, and we can align together. I'm not going to be disobeying the Jesuits. Now, this, of course, the suppression of the Jesuits contributed to the need for a revolution to destroy these disobedient monarchs and to put in a system that allowed them to work in the shadows without being monitored by the monarchs, and that they could ultimately control the world through their agents. That's why you had the French Revolution. Because all of this turmoil with the gross profiteering and slave empire that they were building in South America eventually became a real problem for the monarchs. And the monarchs at the time were not on the Jesuit side. You also had the Protestant Reformation. It was a mess. So they had to do something to reshape Europe and to destroy this monarchical system. Not that they don't want monarchies. They want monarchies. Because we are headed back towards that kind of system. Whether in form or function, we'll see. But the kings of the earth will give their power to the beast. That means you have to have kings. They want kings. The problem is that you had disobedient kings. So we have to destroy this whole thing, and we have to create a system that seems like it's for the people, and it's got dialectics left and right to keep you distracted. And then while that's happening, we can work in the shadows with central banking and revolutions and everything else to take control of everything and put the kings that we want in place. They're going to play ball because they're all initiated. And then once that happens, we'll go back to kingdoms. And that's exactly what you're seeing now. So this contributed to the need to create a solution. And that solution was the French Revolution, which was designed to abolish the disobedient monarchs, introduce a dialectical system that fooled people into believing that they have control over the government, we the people, through voting and everything else, which of course is nonsense. Meanwhile, while the people are distracted, subvert everything in the background through secret societies and shadowy interests. Number 3, introduce the opposite of religion, which is atheism. Atheism came as a result of the French Revolution. And atheism is a justification ultimately to create the the pushback to go back into religion. To get atheism eventually led to communism, and communism is the thing that's supposed to terrorize you and push you back towards Catholicism so that you beg for the authority of the Pope over your life. Because communism is so bad that you would prefer the authority of the Pope and his reasonable mindedness and religion and all these things that seem good on the surface as a solution to communism. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, number 4 is to transition the locus of power into the shadows from out in the open. The mortal wound was given in 1798. The papacy was declared to be at an end, but it didn't really end. The Pope was still there, and the shift of the power went underground to secret societies, central banks, scheming, all these different organizations to bring the Pope back into power. A Pope, of course, at that point in time, after the Pope Clement, I forget which number he was, the 14th or something, but after that Pope Clement got assassinated, the popes played ball, and of course the desire was to get the Pope back into the world and the kings of the earth to give their power to him. But that had to happen over centuries, and to heal the wound politically and spiritually required massive infiltration, revolutions, all the things that we're going to be covering today. So today, these things, 250 years later, are all but accomplished. All the nations have been subverted by revolutions, wars, and central banking. All positions of power are owned and they are initiated. They're in the club. Atheism, secularism, communism have served their purpose to terrorize people and to justify a return to religion and nationalism. And of course, the papacy is coming back into the world as the moral head, the reasonable, tolerant one. That's the voice of reason for society. So, understanding the Jesuit reductions, and as a result, the French Revolution, is crucial to American history. The Jesuits didn't even preach the gospel to these poor Indians. After they ended up leaving, they just left them unconverted. They went back to their pagan ways, and they died in their sins. The Jesuits practiced communism for 150 years before the French Revolution through their Jesuit reductions, and before communism as a thing came out through their puppet Jew, Karl Marx. Remember, papal court Jews. The Jesuits also extorted billions in today's money from that operation. And where do you think that money went? Think it just went nowhere? No, it went to the Rothschilds. And they used the Rothschilds as their banking arm. And today, of course, the Rothschilds are the papal bankers still, which proves to you over and over again that Rome and Judea are united against Christ. The Rothschilds are also intimately involved in American history, so all of this is very on point with what we're talking about today. The French Revolution created ideals that would lead to America's birth as the lamb-like power in history. So all of this is highly related, and it's very important to understand Catholicism's roots and connections to these events so you can see Satan's tentacles going everywhere to the world and, of course, leading to the creation of the United States. Now, that leads us to the next chapter, which is early American history from approximately the 1700s to about the 1900s. The next phase of this journey is from America's founding to a little bit after the Civil War, but before the 20th century. America's trajectory was controlled from the very beginning, and it was consistently diverted and subverted, as you will see. The culmination of these events was the Civil War, which bankrupted the United States and enslaved it to a central banking scheme, just like they did with the Indians, with the people, by enslaving them and putting them in a debt situation. This is the same playbook, but for nations. Cause conflict, destruction, and then save with the central banking system that puts people into debt. That way they are completely enslaved to you forever. People know that countries today like Libya or Syria or Cuba or Iran or whatever, these countries were on the chopping block for a while because of their relationship to central banking. They weren't integrated into the central banking scheme. And of course, this has been the formula for a while. But America was one of the first casualties of that formula. And people don't realize the struggle that took place in this country to eventually put a central bank into it so that it could be controlled. And eventually, so that it could become the sword of the papacy. After the central bank was implemented, America could then borrow money, create all these weapons and army and everything, and become the sword of the papacy. That would subjugate the rest of the world to its central banking schemes. Do you get it? So this is all by design. In the 20th century, that sword, America, was very active. However, today in the 21st century, it will shift from war to false light, to deception, because that journey has been complete. I've talked about this before, like in My Venerable Day of the Sun, number 24, the Final Crusade, that America's journey as the sword of the papacy has come to an end. In the sense that American globalism and the global empire situation, that's collapsing. That is done. We are shifting towards a rebalancing of world power, because that rebalancing will allow for peace to take place. American globalism in the world has accomplished its purpose. That means that you're going to see a transition in American hegemony. America is still going to be very powerful and be part of the world, superpowers, but it's going to be different, because America's role needs to draw back from being the globalist America conquering the world. Of course, there's no globe, but anyway, I'm just saying globalism colloquially. America's role is going to be to draw back from that so that there's peace and harmony, everybody's getting along, everybody's got their nationalistic little empires, and then the role of America as the deceiver can finally be played out. Because, of course, if it's conquering the world and it's subjugating them militarily, people are going to be very resistant to American ideals. So that has to change, because the goal has been accomplished. Nevertheless, the first stop on this journey is Maryland. Maryland is a very important piece of history to understand. It has a very complex history, and today the capital of the United States resides in Maryland. So we need to understand all that went into this territory. Andrew White, which is what the White House is named after, although people will deny it, he was a Jesuit priest, and he became a primary advisor to George Calvert, who was the first Lord Baltimore, and he got him to convert to Catholicism and to plan a Catholic colony to compete with the Protestant pilgrims who had sailed to America. So the Protestants were sailing to America. We can't have that. We need to be right there on their tail. So the Jesuits were right on top of it. In 1620, the Pilgrims came, and in 1628, the planning begins for the Catholic colonies to come and join them. In 1634, the Catholics arrive in America. Eventually, Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, clashed with the Jesuits and their desire for power, of course. And they were conflicting over land acquisitions and ownerships in that area in Maryland, because the Jesuits were claiming clerical immunity. They were arguing basically that they should be exempt from taxes, they should be exempt from military service, and they basically should have, no jurisdiction. The civil courts shouldn't have any jurisdiction on them because they're clerical immunity, which of course they've always used as a ruse to conduct their operations. This obviously led to a lot of conflict, and eventually there was a compromise where Rome allowed the Jesuits to stay in Maryland, but they had to surrender their direct land claims, and they had to hold their properties through various trustees, lay trustees. So there was a compromise done, but they still had their property there. Eventually, the Calvert dynasty crumbled, especially with Protestant rising, the Protestantism rising. Some of them converted to Anglicanism, and so that whole thing kind of dissolved. In 1704, the Maryland Assembly, which was now under Protestant influence, passed harsh laws against Catholics. They prohibited Catholics from operating schools, they forbade the Catholic Mass in public, and they restricted religious orders from acquiring property. So the tide was turning now against the Jesuits, and this was a real problem. In fact, well into the 1800s, just a fun fact, the early America prohibited Catholics from holding office and made them take an oath denying the authority of the papacy. Now, I wonder why people thought that. I wonder why people had that practice. Maybe because they understood their history, and today people don't understand their history. Because Catholicism is an empire, friends. But of course, that changed very quickly. Tells you where we are in the sequence of time. But moving on, by the mid-1700s, the Jesuits had around 12 to 20,000 acres of prime real estate in Maryland. There were major estates like St. Inigo's, Newton, White Marsh. All of these functioned like feudal plantations to build basically a state within a state. Sound familiar? Fun fact, the Jesuits were the largest and most persistent slaveholders in colonial Maryland, using slave labor to finance building their empire. Sound familiar? They argued that as long as the slaves were baptized and they kept the Catholic faith, that slavery was just a neutral institution and it was God's will. Either way, the rising Protestant tensions were creating lots of problems for the beast in the American project. By 1773, the Jesuits were fully suppressed by the Pope, and now the game was changing and it was time to hit the road and start doing real shenanigans. Of course, I've covered the occult roots of the French Revolution in my End Time series, and also how Napoleon tried to create Zionism and the Third Temple by the 1800s, and he failed. I've talked about that quite a bit. Regardless, there needed to be conflict, and that takes us now to the Revolutionary War. So, just a really quick recap. The Jesuits immediately chased the Pilgrims so that they would not let America become Protestant. They established their little foothold in Maryland, but there were a lot of conflicts between them and the royalty there, then the papacy, and then the Protestants started coming up, and they started passing laws against it. It became very convoluted. So what do you do when you're pushed in a corner? Well, you start a revolution, of course. You start a conflict, and then you can manipulate the situation when there's a war and violence and death and so on and so forth. So that takes us now to the Revolutionary War. Most people think that this was just Americans bravely teaming up together and standing up against the British, but there's more to the story as usual. Two major figures in this time were John and Charles Carroll. John was a Jesuit archbishop who played an integral role with many things during this time, and Charles was his aristocratic cousin, which was also probably a Jesuit or Jesuit trained. Important context. 1773, Jesuits were suppressed, and this began a series of important events. John Carroll formed a trust called the Corporation of the Roman Catholic Clergy, or to the Roman Catholic Clergy, or for the Roman Catholic Clergy. I don't remember what I wrote here, but something like that. The Corporation to the Roman Catholic Clergy, to prevent seizure of the Jesuit assets after their suppression. The Jesuits had persisted in Maryland quietly, of course, building up their reserves and infrastructure despite all the previous turmoil and the Protestant, regulations that were being passed against them. Nevertheless, they were very consistently building up their state within a state. Because of the suppression, the Jesuits were motivated to destroy all the monarchs in Europe, including the English monarch, and support revolutions, not just in Europe, but also in America. Because by that time, of course, America had become its own thing with its colonies and everything else. So they were very motivated to help America break free from Britain so that it could become a base of operations. Do you understand? Please understand this, because when it comes to the Civil War 100 years later, you're going to see the tides turning. The Revolutionary War, the Jesuits were very much motivated to help that situation because they had to abolish all monarchs. And in doing so, they would present themselves as an ally to the Americans and basically win their bread or keep their space, so to speak, so they could continue to subvert the land and eventually steer it back to the Pope. Very, very clever. Of course, America was all about freedom of conscience and tolerance. So by aiding the Protestants against the monarch, the Jesuits could secure their spot and build America into what they wanted to, which is coming up right now. In 1774, 1 year after the suppression of the Jesuits, George III, the British monarch, signed the Quebec Act. Of course, this law was very important because it extended the borders of Quebec, which was Catholic. It was a Catholic province at the time, up in Canada, down to the Ohio River, and it gave these Catholics religious tolerance. So George III did that as a strategic ploy because he figured by doing that, the Catholics in Quebec are not going to align themselves with the Americans in a revolution in case the British have to invade America and conquer it. So he's giving some favors to these Catholics in Quebec, and that's, part of the political shenanigans going on. Of course, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and many others reacted with fury. They viewed it as a popish plot to circle the Protestant colonies, so they were very much against the papacy. This drove many colonists to join the revolution, and the Jesuits' interests also took advantage of this because they saw, okay, now there's a real conflict. We can really take advantage of this and be on their side. George III was very friendly to Catholics in general compared to most monarchs. There's no convincing evidence that I could find that he was secretly Catholic, but probably he was just concerned with maintaining his power. So he's very ecumenical at the time. He didn't want to lose Quebec to America, obviously, so he gave the Catholics tolerance and a place that the Jesuits could go and operate despite being suppressed. So he was just trying to avoid, spiraling damage. He probably also knew, I'm guessing, about all of the stories of the Jesuits assassinating people and starting revolutions, especially in England in 1605 with the Gunpowder Plot. If you don't know about that, practically all of English Parliament and the King were almost blown to smithereens. It was stopped, obviously, but they tried to do that. So the Jesuits were very well known in Europe, and George III probably was just trying to hedge his bets. Either way, the Quebec Act set the stage for the revolution by angering people and inciting people to join the rebellion and to really create this American Revolution. John Carroll, remember, the Jesuit archbishop, was sent on a diplomatic mission by the Continental Congress in 1776 to convince the French Catholics to fight for the Americans. Of course, it failed, but his cousin Charles Carroll secured a French alliance 2 years later in 1778. This brought thousands of Catholics to America, and culture, of course, was shaped accordingly by these Catholics and by the situation to be more ecumenical. Like, hey, listen, we're going to come and help you, so quit with the anti-Pope stuff. Don't be burning effigies of the Pope. Don't be making, these kinds of statements. Let's get along. So compromise is the name of the game that happened. The Americans got help, but in exchange, they had to be more tolerant of the Catholic situation. Do you see where this is going? Charles Carroll, John's cousin, and also, like I said, Jesuit trained, was the only Catholic signer of the Constitution, which signifies to you that Catholicism had planted its seed with America from the very beginning to turn it into a vassal state. By having that person as a representative there, that was a statement that we are going to be in on this nation's history in fulfillment of God's word. John Carroll was also good friends with Benjamin Franklin, who was a Grand Master Freemason, and of course Franklin recommended John Carroll to the Vatican as the best leader for the new American Church. Washington also actively discouraged anti-Catholic behavior and had a Catholic secretary. He also had a painting of the Virgin Mary in his study or room or whatever. This is what it looks like. This is the pastel portrait of the Virgin Mary, originally hung in the new room at the Mount Vernon together with its pennant, a pastel of John the Evangelist. It is not known when the Washingtons acquired this set of pastels. The style of the drawing suggests it was inspired by the work of Italian artist Rosalba Carriera. So this is a painting of the Virgin Mary that Washington had in his residence, which is just very strange. And of course, today Washington is lauded as a Freemason and first president. He's also deified, that means being made to be a god, in the Capitol building as, an art form. So was Washington a closet Catholic? Was he Jesuit? Was he compromised? Who knows? Who really knows? But compromise was always the name of the game from the very beginning. When the church compromised with Constantine in the 4th century and allowed Constantine to redefine the Sabbath, that set the stage for the counterfeit. When the Americans compromised on their values for the sake of safety, they allowed the enemy in. And of course, today you have a vassal state that is ready to serve the Pope. And you will learn more and more as we go on because there's a lot to talk about here. Either way, after the war in 1789, John Carroll, being free now to do his, thing, established the first Jesuit base of operations in Maryland called Georgetown University. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson knew that this was the beginning of the end because the Jesuits had helped them win their war of independence from the monarchy, yet only to be quietly subverted to the monarchy of the papacy eventually as the price. So Thomas Jefferson and John Adams knew what had happened. They understood that because they had won their independence and this country that they're establishing is a country based on religious tolerance, that the Jesuits would now take advantage of this situation and eventually subjugate America to another monarch, which of course is the papacy. This is another picture. This is a quote from Catholic Life. Yes, George Washington, the first president of the United States, displayed a painting of the Virgin Mary in his home at Mount Vernon. So you see, people know about this thing. And the question is why? Why would he have that? Why would he be so pro-Catholic? Why would he be called a Freemason? Why is he deified? What's going on here? This looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon kind of stuff. Anyway, John Adams and the Jesuits. This is a little quote that they have. In May 1816, Adams wrote to Jefferson about the restoration of the Jesuits when they were basically, I think 1812 is when they were restored, but nevertheless, this letter is about the restoration. I do not like the reappearance of the Jesuits. Shall we not have regular swarms of them here, in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume, dressed as printers, publishers, writers, and schoolmasters? If ever there was a body of men who merited damnation on earth and in hell, it is the Society of Loyolas. Nevertheless, we are compelled by our system of religious toleration to offer them asylum. Do you understand what happened with the Revolutionary War? And how the Jesuits were aiding the Americans so that they could secure their spot and abuse the religious tolerance, the lamb-like quality of the Americas, the American experiment, to turn it into a vassal state for the papacy. And this is exactly what they are commenting on. Fun fact, by 1838, Georgetown was facing bankruptcy, so it sold 272 men, women, and children as slaves for about $3.3 million in today's money to pay for its debts. Jesuits refused instructions to keep the families together, but sold them to brutal Deep South plantations and allowed the families to be torn apart. And so they got into abusive situations. So the Jesuits didn't care. They were still doing slavery. They were still participating in slavery. And they were happy to, as long as they could get the money to pay off their debts. So make sure that you, when people are saying that the Jews are the only ones doing the slave trade, remind them of this kind of history. Conclusion. There is still some more to go, obviously, but what we have learned so far about the Catholic contributions to American history are the following. From the beginning of America's history, Catholic interests were very close by to steer America back to the papacy. They did not let America just go willy-nilly on its own because they understood the consequence of a power across the sea that would be left alone to itself. So they were there from the very beginning. Early on, they pursued the first colonists to establish a position before that territory could be completely controlled. Maryland was their base of operations, and of course today Maryland is where the capital of the United States is based. So what does that tell you? Jesuits were some of the biggest participators in the slave trade and slavery, and they built a state within a state, just like they did with the reductions in South America. When the Jesuits were finally suppressed, they went into overdrive supporting the American colonists to win their freedom from the British monarchy so that America could be open to influence and control. Again, there is no such thing as a patriotic Catholic or a Catholic patriot, unless, of course, that Catholic resides in the Vatican. Catholic patriotism during the Revolutionary War, pay attention to this, Catholic patriotism during the Revolutionary War was a ruse to ultimately get America back under the papacy. It was conditional patriotism. Do you get it? It wasn't unconditional patriotism. It was conditional patriotism designed to get America back under the papacy eventually and to serve Catholic interests. Today, Catholic patriotism is the same exact thing. Most people do not realize when they see people like Joe Kent or Carrie Prejean Bowler or any of these Catholic conservative pundits like Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, etc., 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 that these are agents of the papacy that are conditionally patriotic. Do you understand? They seem like true patriots. They're all about America. They're not. They want an American vassal state to the papacy. They are conditional patriots. They're not unconditional patriots. So people need to realize that. Now let's talk about famous assassinations. In the time between the Revolutionary War happening, America winning, and the Civil War, where the Jesuits would side against America. So you went for America when it served their interest, and then against America when it also served their interest. Many, many significant assassinations happened. Bill Hughes covers this in his book, The Secret Terrorists, and I've documented them in my Synagogue of Satan series, so I'm just going to mention them here briefly. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, 1826, they were both poisoned and killed on America's birthday as a statement. That's 4th of July. As you can see from their quote to each other about what they thought about the Jesuits, and the Jesuits knew that, so they killed them. Andrew Jackson, they failed to assassinate him in 1835 for fighting against the central banking schemes. James Monroe, 1831. The official story is that he died of a heart attack, of heart failure and tuberculosis, but he was probably poisoned because of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was basically a slap in the face to the European powers, especially the papacy, and basically said, listen, we're not going to, it has its own destiny. We don't subjugate ourselves to any power. Of course, that was a very big slap in the face for them. So important context with that. 1814, the Jesuits were reinstated. The papacy began playing ball with them, and now Satan's two systems, the black and the white, were more unified. In 1822, there was the Congress of Verona, where many European monarchs stood against America's independence, and people were trying to decide what to do with America because it was rising in power by then. In 1823, in response to that, that's when the Monroe Doctrine was published by James Monroe, which is that America was basically sovereign, and we're not papists. We don't bow down to any external authority. We are our own sovereign. Of course, how did that go? Not so well, right? And Monroe was probably poisoned because of that. In 1841, William Henry Harrison died 30 years after his inauguration for refusing to bow down to central banking Jesuit schemes. Zachary Taylor in 1850 was poisoned for resisting expansion of slavery, which of course the Jesuits were trying to push at that point in time to divide America into North and South to prepare for the Civil War that they had planned. Zachary Taylor was resisting these things, and he was poisoned for resisting the agenda. James Buchanan, 1857, a failed attempt on his life to poison him, which was called the National Hotel Disease, where basically there was some banquet and a lot of people broke out in sickness and even died where he was staying, but he was not poisoned. He avoided it. And of course, Abraham Lincoln in 1865. John Wilkes Booth was the Jesuit operative. Also, you had Mary and John Surratt, which were Catholic operatives that fled to the Vatican afterward. So from that point in time, you had how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 assassinations / attempted assassinations, constantly trying to subvert America with all sorts of shenanigans. There's also the Great Famine in 1845 to 1855, parallel to all these things. So these are, we're recapitulating now, okay? So we're going layer after layer after layer. So you had the assassinations and the various assassination attempts. Now another layer is the Great Famine in Ireland. That's 1845 to 1855. This was the Great Potato Famine that was weaponized by Catholic interests to send waves of immigrants into America to change its demographics. Sound familiar? Throughout the famine, Ireland remained a net exporter of food, so they weren't actually going hungry. The problem was this was just a manipulated situation. England took all the livestock, took all the butter, took all the grain, and left the Irish basically to die, forcing them to immigrate. Of course, this was very strategic on England's part, because, so this was a two-part situation, okay? You have to understand this was two-part. On one part, you had the English who hated the Irish, and they let them starve so that they would migrate to America, so that Ireland would then be theirs for the taking, basically, for the colonization, and America, their enemy, would also be destabilized. So this was an English situation also. However, the Jesuits capitalized on this, and they had agents like Archbishop John Hughes, which was called Dagger John, who was a ruthless agent of the beast at that time, who organized everyone into political voting blocks, basically establishing these refugees in segments that were very pro-Catholic, pro-government, pro-voting. Come on, guys, let's go out to the polls. Let's really affect political change. So they really weaponized this situation. And let's see, what was I going to look up? This was democracy. Oh yeah, this is Samuel Morse is a witness for that time. This is in 1835. Samuel Morse fears a Catholic conspiracy. Irish immigrants in the early 19th century filled jobs created by the market revolution. Their arrival provided an important source of labor for a growing economy, but many Americans worried about the influence of these arrivals. Samuel Morse, an inventor who contributed to the development of the telegraph and Morse code, feared that Irish immigrants represented the front line of a Catholic conspiracy to destroy the United States. Now, he says the following, that a vigorous and unexampled effort is making by the despotic governments of Europe to cause popery to overspread this country is a fact too palpable to be contradicted. Did not official documents lately published but put this fact beyond dispute, yet the writer had personal evidence of sufficient to convince him of the fact that the political object of the enterprise, while residing in Italy in the years 1830 to 31, from conversations with nobles and gentlemen of different countries, with the offers of various foreign governments visiting and resident in the Roman and Austrian states, and with priests and other ecclesiastes of the Roman faith. Sometimes it was hinted to him as a check to too sanguine and anticipations of the triumph of the experiment of our democratic republican government. Sometimes it was told him by the former class in a tone of exultation that a cause was in operation which would surely overthrow our institutions and gradually bring us under a form of government less obnoxious to the pride and less dangerous to the existence of the antiquated despotic systems of Europe. In addition to these hints to the writer concerning the efforts making by the governments of Europe to carry popery through all our borders, other American travelers will testify to similar hints made to them. By one I am permitted to say that the celebrated naturalist, the late Baron Cuvier, known also as the zealous Protestant, inquired of him who marks of concern, if it were indeed true that popery had made much progress in the United States, as to cause the exultation, which it seems was no secret, among the legitimates of Europe. And again, that a distinguished member of the Protestant German embassies in Rome also made similar inquiries of him, having heard much boasting of the progress of popery in the United States, adding this pertinent remark, quote, "They will be a hammer or nails, sir, they will persecute or be persecuted." These facts may be of so much importance in aid of the other proofs of conspiracy, which these numbers unfold, as to show that among the various higher classes of Europe, the enterprise of Popish Crusade in this country, interesting that he uses the word Popish Crusade. Popish Crusade in this country is not only a subject of notoriety, but is viewed with great interest and is considered as having a most important political bearing. Mistrust of all popery does, or affects to do, whether a friend or foe in any of the part of this country, is the only feeling that true charity, universal charity, allows us to indulge. Foreign spies have clothed themselves in religious dress, and so awestruck are our journalists at its sacred texture, or so unwilling to discern the difference between the man and his mask, that they stay away in fear, lest they should be called bigoted or intolerant or persecuting, if they should venture to lift up the consecrated cloak that hides a foreign foe. In other words, if you're daring to expose these people as they are, they're going to call you bigots. Does that sound familiar? Americans, if you depend on your daily press, you rely on a broken reed if it fails you in your need. It dare not attack popery. It dare not attack into the light the political enemies of your liberty, because they come in the name of religion. All despotic Europe is awake and active in plotting your downfall, and yet they let you sleep, and you choose not to be awakened. Quote, "A little more sleep, a little more slumber, a little more folding of the hands to sleep. And now, like a man whose house is on fire, dreaming of comfort and security, you will perhaps repel with passion and reproach the friendly hand that would wake you in season to escape with your life." This was like 200 years ago, approximately. This was like 200 years ago, where Samuel Morse basically saw the conspiracy that these Irish immigrants were coming into the country and reshaping culture. Of course, I think when this was published, this was even before the Great Potato Famine, which was even more of an influx of Irish immigrants. He saw the fact that this was a papal crusade. He saw that the Pope's influence was trying to get more and more influence entrenched into the country. He saw that they were changing the demographics. He saw that they were weaponizing cultural shaping, like if you tried to expose these things, people were saying, "Oh, you're being anti-Catholic," or whatever else. He saw all these things. This was like 200 years ago, folks. And of course, this was all in preparation for the Civil War. Now, there's also the Metternich Plan, which you should be aware of. Samuel Morse published a paper called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States in 1835, which we, I believe, read from. He argued that an alliance led by the Austrian Prince Metternich, who was connected to the Council of Verona in 1822, had a design to destroy the American public. Morse claimed that the plan involved flooding America with immigrants to dismantle Protestant infrastructure and reshape America into a Catholic vassal state. He identified St. Leopold, the St. Leopold Foundation in Austria, as the financial vehicle used to funnel money from European royalty to the Jesuits in America so that they could operate their state within a state. They were using charities as a front for political operations. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Hopefully it does. There's also the mysterious fires of the 1800s, which is another layer on top of this. Throughout the 1800s, you had very curious, however significant fires throughout America. The timing and placement of these fires tells us they were very deliberate, just like the Maui fires of today and in California of recent history. Of course, there's nothing new under the sun. In 1835, you had just a couple of examples, but in 1835, you had the Great Fire of New York, which happened at the height of the banking war between Andrew Jackson and the central bankers. 1871, another one that was called the Great Chicago Fire, destroyed lots of Protestant urban areas. And eventually these were replaced with Catholic infrastructure, Catholic schools, Catholic churches, etc., etc. There's many others. And of course, the timing and the placement all provided an economic instability that was justification for the Civil War and tensions rising. It also reshaped demographics and infrastructure towards the beast agenda and Catholic interests. So conclusion, going into the Civil War and even afterward, America was consistently destabilized from countless angles. Immigration to change the demographics, culture shaping, coordinated destruction, rising civil unrest, by facilitating divisions between the various states, presidential assassinations, financial assaults and schemes, etc., etc., etc. Just like you see today, the formula and the playbook has never changed, folks. Order out of chaos. Now, let's talk about the Civil War. The Civil War was the final solution to the American problem. The Jesuits used America's strength, which is its plurality of leadership, as its weakness. They funded both sides and instigated differences so that the country could basically be bankrupt and be taken over. August Belmont and Judah Benjamin were people who were connected to the Rothschild banking scheme. They were the representatives, and they were working with both sides. August Belmont was with the North, Judah Benjamin with the South, and they handled the flow of capital into both sides because the Rothschilds were funding both sides of the war, as usual. Lincoln authorized the Treasury to print greenbacks in response to these very high interest loans that the Rothschilds were giving to both sides. The interest was something between 24 to 36%, which is enormous, which of course the interest was designed to get you to be bankrupt because you have a need. So here's a very high interest loan. So Lincoln saw that, and of course one of the things that sealed his death warrant was passing the bill to get the Treasury to print greenbacks, which were, their own currency without any debt. And that was a real problem. Now, in 1886, a book by a former Catholic priest who repented, called Charles Chiniquy, the book's title is 50 Years in the Church of Rome. This book claims that Abraham Lincoln said the following: "This war would have never been possible without the sinister influence of the Jesuits. We owe it to popery that we now see our land reddened with the blood of her noblest sons." Now, Chiniquy was a close friend of Lincoln because Lincoln was a lawyer and he helped Chiniquy get out of some court issues with the Jesuits. And Chiniquy got out of the Catholic Church and wrote an expose on them. Of course, Chiniquy is ridiculed by Catholic apologists, but we know better if we know history and the Bible together. Freemasons were also very heavily involved with the Civil War and the many battles that were coordinated. Albert Pike, famous 33rd degree Freemason and a pervert, was instrumental in organizing the Southern Rebellion through his various organizations like the Knights of the Golden Circle. Robert E. Lee, George McClellan, Winfield Hancock, Louis Armstead, and many others were Freemasons. Gettysburg, you had situations like Gettysburg where there were tactical delays and stand-down orders by Hancock to not pursue the Confederates. And these were Masonic courtesies that they were giving to each other. Because the ones at the top were all part of the order, so that superseded whatever divisions they had on the surface. McClellan was also accused by Lincoln of failing to engage the enemy even when there was a clear advantage, especially at Antietam. So there were many situations like these where the Masonic interests were prolonging the conflict. They were prolonging the conflict unnecessarily to further indenture America into destruction and debt and casualties and so on, to basically end up completely capitulating America to the central banking scheme. So the Freemasons were very integral in that. Of course, you also have the Skull and Bones, which was started in 1832 by William Russell. Russell founded it after spending a summer in Germany where people like Bill Hughes and even Anthony Sutton claimed that he was initiated into the Illuminati at that time. And he created the Order of the Skull and Bones as a way to bring people into that shadowy system. Of course, you remember Illuminati was tied to the Jesuits through Adam Weishaupt, who was a Jesuit-trained professor of canon law, quote-unquote Protestant, and he was probably even, his family, I believe, were crypto-Jews. So, they're all synagogue of Satan as far as I'm concerned, but the point is this, that these things are just secular things that seem like secular fronts, but really they're just Jesuitism in disguise. The Jesuits have multiple proxy organizations that all communicate with one another. But the devil gave his throne and power to Rome, folks. So you have to understand that whether it's Skull and Bones or Freemasonry or whatever else, they all ultimately play with Satan's schemes. People like George Bush, William Taft, John Kerry, etc., are all puppets to these orders. And between that and the Freemasons and the Jesuits, every position of power has been controlled. They also incorporate institutions like the Carnegie Foundation and the Johns Hopkins University as fronts. Again, you see the same stuff, whether it's the St. Leopold Foundation or Catholic Charities or Johns Hopkins University. The secret societies always use the front of something noble and good, like a university, Georgetown University maybe, and a charity or whatever else to make you think like, hey, they're a positive in the world. They're doing so much good in the world, when in fact those are just bases of operations for them to operate in broad daylight. That's how they do, because they are of their father, the devil, who appears as an angel of light, but in fact he is darkness. So these are culture-shaping tools, and the design is so that you don't see the Jesuits everywhere. You see this organization, that organization, and everybody is taking the blame when in fact they're all part of the club, and the Jesuits are the one orchestrating everything. The papacy also was very supportive of the Confederacy. Fun fact, Pius IX called Jefferson Davis the illustrious, quote, illustrious and honorable president of the Confederate States of the America, in a letter in 1863. In 1864, the Confederacy sent Bishop Patrick Lynch to Rome to have a high-level meeting with various authorities to get Catholic support so they could have formal recognition as their own country. As a result, in 1867, Congress severed all diplomatic ties with the Vatican, something that was only repealed in 1984 by Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, was the one to first appoint a U.S. ambassador to Rome, and also the first one to take his presidential vows toward the obelisk, which was assigned to all Jesuits throughout the world that America had finally been taken over. After the war, you saw the Act of 1871, which repealed individual charters of the city of Washington and Georgetown and created a municipal corporation, the Corporation of the United States in D.C. Of course, the debt of the Civil War justified the new federal government to take out massive amounts of money and loans from the Rothschild central banks. In 1873, $300 million loan was taken, about $10 billion in today's money, which facilitated many things, but it was through the Rothschild banking systems, also through the Baring Brothers banks. All of this set the stage for the Federal Reserve Act in a few decades later. After the war, you also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which is very important to understand because Albert Pike was very connected to the KKK. He was a Freemason, and the KKK symbolism is also very Catholic and Crusader-like, because you should know that Freemasonry has two sides. It has the Jewish side and the Catholic side. They meet at the top, but there's two sides to Freemasonry. Now, if you look at the capirote, if you look at these things, this is a capirote is a Christian pointed hat of canonical form that is used in Italy, Spain, and Hispanic countries by members of a confraternity of penitents, particularly those of the Catholic Church. It is part of the uniform of such brotherhoods, including the Nazarenos and Fariseos, during Lenten observations and reenactments of the Holy Week in Spain, and its former colonies through similar hoods are common. Those similar hoods are common in other Christian countries such as Italy. Capirote are worn by penitents so that the attention is not drawn towards themselves as they repent, but instead to God. Really? Because this draws a lot of attention when you're parading around with hoods and, these robes. Here we are. Look at these robes with these giant hoods. Oh, no, we're not drawing attention. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. Give me a freaking break, man. But nevertheless, this is a Catholic thing, and yet Ku Klux Klan has the same exact situation with their little Knights of Columbus or Knights of Malta, Red Cross and their capirote. This is a Catholic situation. The Spanish Inquisition used these hoods to correct heretics, quote unquote, correct them. And of course, the KKK also considered itself to be a form of inquisition, terrorizing people, shaping culture to maintain control, infiltrating society. They also were very militant-like, very knight-like, crusader-like. So just look at the fruits to know the roots, folks. By the 1920s, the KKK evolved into being a propaganda machine. It became very quote-unquote anti-Catholic. But this was just a dialectic to make Catholics look like the pariahs. Just like what you're seeing now with the Protestants persecuting the Catholics, not letting them have their thing. All the people like Doug Wilson saying, we're going to ban Eucharistic processions. All of this is just designed hoopla to make you think that the Protestants are the bloodthirsty ones. And the Catholics are just these poor little lambs getting terrorized. So there's nothing new under the sun, especially if you see history like this. You understand that these things just repeat over time. Nevertheless, this helped silence Protestant critique of Catholicism and of Rome, of popery, as being hateful, because the Roman Catholic Church was the victim of these poor KKK, inquisitions. Today, in fact, you see the same rhetoric with these things, and it's going to increasingly grow. I have a sense that it's going to get worse and worse as this administration breathes its last, because that will justify a Catholic takeover. As a result of these dialectics in the 1920s, with the KKK, the federal government stepped in and acted as the, quote, voice of reason to protect civil rights and pass various laws and, get involved and so on. However, this made the federal government even more powerful, which was the entire goal. You have to understand that after 1871, after the goal of bankrupting America and subjugating it financially was accomplished, you will see increasing efforts after that to increase the size of the federal government and to increase control over the people. And of course, today we are at the end of that. We're very controlled. There's no freedom in this country. Nevertheless, after 1871, you will see consistent event after event after event to subjugate the country to the power that be. So, conclusion, the Civil War was a major inflection point in America's history, and you should be familiar with everything that I just revealed to you here with the Civil War, because after the Civil War, America was subjugated and its destiny was sealed. Less than 100 years prior, the Jesuits had sided with the Americans so that they could get the advantage of having a base of operations, only to turn around and betray America by working with their agents and other secret societies to destabilize the Union and, of course, lead it into bankruptcy. That's who you're dealing with, folks. That's why the Jesuits cannot be considered patriots. That's why Catholic interests cannot be considered patriotic. Rome's communication with the South and the central banking interests capitalizing on America's bankruptcy paint a very clear picture of manipulation that all of this was by design. By design. The fact that American history clearly shows you a distrust for Catholic power is very, very important. Yet after the Civil War, this changed. And today America is all but completely controlled openly by Catholic interests. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were against the Jesuits' reinstatement, and they were afraid that the Jesuits would come and basically take over and infiltrate the country. James Madison, in his Memorial and Remonstrance, said nothing but evil things, exposed nothing but evils of the Catholic Church. Catholics were prohibited from having political positions or voting originally, being involved in government. Samuel Morse spoke of a conspiracy to undermine the American, republic by the Catholic popery interests. Congress banned diplomatic ties with Rome. All of these things are real history. And yet today we are to believe that Catholics were such patriots for this country, that they had such loving and wonderful desires for this country to be a true, American experiment. Nonsense. So you have to know your history, folks, because these things are real history and people have forgotten them. Now, yet another layer on this satanic cake is dispensationalism. I have been long hours exposing dispensationalism on its origins with the Jesuits Manuel Lacunza, Robert Bellarmine, and Francisco Ribera. 150 years before Darby, Irving, and Schofield, the Jesuits were planning to destroy Protestantism by exporting false eschatology. And, of course, this had many purposes, because it first diverted attention away from Rome as the Antichrist power, while Rome was busy doing all of these attacks against the USA. So the design was this: do all of these things, take the Protestant mind off of Rome and somewhere else, so that we can more actively do these things without people being suspicious. Number two, launder tons of money through the birth of Zionism and the State of Israel to their various interests and governmental agencies and NGOs and everything else. Number 3, eventually discredit the Protestants totally because of their support for the Jews, which is exactly what's happening now. Now Satan is cashing in his chips that he started hundreds of years ago to destroy Protestantism. And now those chips are being cashed in, and Protestants look absolutely ridiculous. Meanwhile, Catholics are being raised up as saying, look, we're not Zionists. We're not part of this Zionist-occupied government. We're for the people. All by design, folks. All by design. So if you are still a dispensationalist, you have to come out of that because it's a deception. It's designed to deceive the nations and deceive Americans and Christians so that they don't understand who the real power who's pulling the strings is. Darby, Irving, and Schofield were all very disturbed individuals, very well documented. Schofield was probably a Freemason, or at least a wannabe Freemason, and he was a puppet. So you can learn about that in my Great Delusion series, but that's just another contribution, quote unquote, by Catholicism to America is dispensationalism. People think Zionism began with Theodor Herzl, and the Protestants just kind of catched onto it, but that's not true. Zionism began with the Jesuits, my friend. And Napoleon was very ready to build a third temple in 1800. They were ready to pull this narrative off like 200 years ago. But that didn't pan out, obviously. So they pivoted and they tried again 100 years later with the Balfour Declaration, the creation of the State of Israel, and Hitler, and so on and so forth. Either way, all that Jew-hating and Zionism people are awake to now, it's all controlled demolition. It's all controlled demolition. The Jesuits created Zionism and used it against America by destroying the Protestant mind. And now they're cashing in their chips to destroy American politics once and for all and reshape them in the Catholic image, the Catholic social teaching image. Because American politics is completely compromised by Zionism. And that's all by design. So is Protestantism. That's all by design. And if you understand that Zionism started with the Jesuits, not with just Theodor Herzl and the Rothschilds and the Jew coming after you. No, the Jews are what? Remember Christopher Columbus? They are papal court Jews. They are Rothschild, the shield that's in front, the red shield, the Roman red shield that's in front. So the Rothschilds were part of it, of course, but they weren't the only part. The people who invented the framework for dispensationalism were the Jesuits. They were already planning to do that with their puppet Napoleon, long before Theodor Herzl was even born. And of course, Theodor Herzl was born into that situation, into the climate started after Napoleon. I go into that in my French Revolution series, but nevertheless, the point is the Zionist takeover was not something that just organically happened with a bunch of Jews. The Jews are put forward to you as the scapegoat, but it's much more complicated than that. Now, let's move to the early 20th century, which is approximately 1900 to 1950, right after the World War II. The 20th century had many major things that deserve discussion on this topic. After 1871, the push to get America under a central bank maximized in the events of 1913. Jacob Schiff and his brother-in-law Paul Warburg, both Rothschild papal interests, were the architects of the Jekyll Island situation. In 1906, Schiff warned that the U.S. had to get under a central bank, otherwise there would be a monetary panic. 1 year later, what do you have? You have the Panic of 1907. Here it is. The Panic of 1907, also known as the 1907 Bankers' Panic or Knickerbocker Crisis, was a financial crisis that took place in the United States over a 3-week period starting in mid-October, when the New York Stock Exchange suddenly fell almost 50% from its peak the previous year. The panic occurred during a time of economic recession, and there were numerous runs affecting banks and trust companies. The 1907 panic eventually spread throughout the nation, where many state and local banks and businesses entered bankruptcy. The primary cause of the run included a retraction of the market liquidity by a number of New York City banks and a loss of confidence among depositors, exacerbated by unregulated side bets and bucket shops. So, you have to understand all these things that happen with banking and crashes, they happen as tools to increase government oversight, increase presence of Jesuit influence in assets by transferring wealth, and to destroy the middle class. You will see many such panics throughout history. And of course, at the time of this recording, we are unfolding in a massive economic, panic that's going to redefine the world's financial system. So these things are always designed and coordinated. If there weren't evil interests in the world, there would be no such thing as crashes and panics. Things would just proceed normally. But you can't have normal economics when people are in charge at the top and they're manipulating situations. You can't have normal economics. So you had the panic of 1907, a year after Jacob Schiff warns that if we don't do something, we don't do this central banking thing, that there's going to be a crisis. And of course, what happened? The crisis happened. Now, as a result, you had a reason to justify the creation of a central bank. There was a cultural precedent now because people are like, oh, maybe we need a central bank. Maybe we need a central bank. J.P. Morgan, who has manipulated financial markets throughout history, billions of dollars worth of fraud from J.P. Morgan, deliberately withheld liquidity from rival trust companies and created a nationwide panic to exacerbate this situation. Morgan then, as a result, saved the economy with capital through loans and everything else, but this was all just market manipulation, so that Schiff's narrative of a central bank, which would benefit all of these bigwigs, would come to pass and people would understand, oh, maybe we need a central bank. Then, a few years later, right before the Act of 1913, you had the Titanic. The Panic of 1907 was the culture shaping that they needed to shape people's ideologies, and the Titanic eliminated the wealthy opposition. So you had two strikes, 1-2 punch. You had the culture shaping of the Panic of 1907, and then you had the Titanic, which eliminated all of the wealthy opposition to this being passed so that there would be no challenge. You had John Jacob Astor IV. He was the wealthiest man in the world. It was on the Titanic. Benjamin Guggenheim, very powerful mining tycoon. Isidor Straus, the owner of Macy's, and many others. These people were obstacles for passing a central bank in the United States. Okay, so they had to be killed. This is a problem. So J.P. Morgan switched the plates that were on the Olympic and the Titanic and disguised the Olympic as the Titanic, with the Olympic being damaged from a previous collision. And of course, they committed serious insurance fraud with the sinking, and they marketed it as because they marketed it unsinkable. But nevertheless, they committed insurance fraud. They got some money out of it, and because they marketed it as unsinkable and this prestigious thing, they did that on purpose so they would lure these rich men to this, trap and kill them, and basically have no more opposition. J.P. Morgan originally was signed onto the cruise, so of course that was also another reason for these people to go, because all the bigwigs were on it, but he mysteriously and miraculously canceled his ticket at the last minute, just like all of the Jews, like Larry Silverstein, took out an insurance policy miraculously right before the 9/11 events, or some of these guys didn't show up. All the same stuff, folks. There's nothing new under the sun. On the boat itself, you had the high-ranking Jesuit Francis Brown, who boarded for the first leg to take reconnaissance photographs, but then was told to get off before the final leg, so the Jesuits and secret societies had their paws all over it. That's very, very, very important evidence. Now, as a result of these two events, the Federal Reserve was created, and so was the income tax, which enslaved America and the middle class to the papacy's agents, but of course this was just the beginning. In 1929, you had the Lateran Treaty, and this was the healing of the wound, the political wound to the papacy, where the papacy was basically getting all its territories back. It got its money and everything else. But we are now close to the wound healing spiritually. So the wound was healed politically in 1929. And of course, probably by 2029, I'm expecting that wound will be healed spiritually and people will begin to be marveling after the beast. But we'll see how it goes. Nevertheless, today, I believe that we're just a few years from that. Like I said, most people don't know the relationship between 1929 and the Lateran Pact of 1929 and the stock market crash later in that year. That was the signal of the Great Depression. The Vatican was officially created in 1929, and they received $92 million at that time in gold and cash for the lost territories that Italy had taken over. So, of course, the Italian government subjugated itself to the papacy and transferred all that money back into the papacy. And this was used to create the Vatican Bank, which you will learn quite a bit about today, which has been nothing but corruption and laundering. Nevertheless, central banks and market manipulators like J.P. Morgan yet again coordinated a crisis to shift wealth back to Rome. So right after they got all of that money, within 6 months or so, you saw the stock market crash of 1929. And of course, JP Morgan and all these people were involved in it. And what do? They transferred assets to one person or another, because when these things crash, who is the one that has the money to buy up the assets? It's the people in power. And that's why these things are always transfers of wealth. Now, another person to talk about is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, very influential in creating the early theories of globalism, which would create the framework for the 80 plus years of American imperialism being used as the sword of Rome. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit. He's a very influential Jesuit. He is often called the father of the New Age. He had the Omega Point theory, which is basically just the singularity, New World Order, cosmic consciousness kind of thing. He was the mind behind the League of Nations, and which was eventually turned into the United Nations after World War II. And of course, today we are coming out of this reality, out of the globalist reality, because globalism was just designed as a giant dialectic to push on the world, to create chaos. And now we are moving away from that back into a more balanced power system where there's nations, nation states, nationalism. Everybody's sticking to their own. There's multiple reserve currencies. I've talked about that quite a bit in my Venerable Day of the Sun 24, the transition into the final phase, which is the transition from the seventh head that rules, which is the United States, the globalist United States, into the image of the beast, which is the eighth. The image of the beast is a worldwide situation, and all of these countries will be subjugated to the beast. So there has to be a little more balance of power and peace and getting along. Hollywood is another thing to talk about. Most people think that Hollywood is Jewish, but that's not true. Early Hollywood was very much Catholic, and it was very much a shaping tool. Daniel Lord, the Jesuit, wrote the production code in 1930, and the Jesuits were famous for their theaters in Europe, shaping culture and public opinion, and even developing technologies for projecting things onto walls, like the camera obscura. They were very famous for developing and putting that forward. So the Jesuits were very proficient at shaping people's opinion with theater. This was actually one of the main tools of the Counter-Reformation. And today Hollywood is flipping from dark to light. It's flipping away from all of the nasty, secular, satanic, obviously satanic stuff into more family-friendly, religious-minded stuff. You see lots of celebrities coming back to religion, back to Catholicism. It's only a matter of time before Hollywood resumes its role to shape the culture. It has to be, folks. It has to be. Think about this, okay? It has to. Hollywood is always designed as a culture-shaping tool. When it was time to push the world in a liberal direction, Hollywood became very liberal. They gave it to the Jews. Go ahead and do your worst. Now it's time to rein it back in and move it towards the direction of Catholic social teaching. So you're going to see a Catholic Hollywood again. And it's just a matter of time. Science, another thing to talk about. Georges Lemaitre, S.J., published The Big Bang Theory in 1927, which set the stage to reinforce things like evolution, space, the globe, NASA, and all the deceptions that came later as a result of these things. I have many hours of series on cosmology, especially my heliocentric conspiracy series, which is, I think, over 20 hours. So make sure you check that out. Lots to talk about with the Catholic influence over cosmology in that situation. But conclusion, as you can see, these people are relentless and they never stop, constantly exercising their shenanigans all over in every aspect of situation. Financial terrors, culture shaping, political schemes, and even scientific manipulation are all the flavors of the contributions of the Roman Catholic Church to American history. Now, we come to World War II. World War II is the next major topic to discuss because there's many hours of things to talk about. We're not going to talk about for many hours here, but I'm just going to go over these things just in brief. This is a very expansive area, but for today's presentation, the main points that tie to the beast are as follows. The Roman Catholic Church was very involved with the Nazis in many ways. The rat lines are an example, helping the Nazis escape to South America. The SS was modeled after the Jesuit order, according to Himmler. The Jesuit priest Bernhard Stumpfel wrote Mein Kampf for Hitler. Knights of Malta helped Hitler rise to power, like Franz von Papen. Vatican was very involved in treatises like the Reich Concordat, and basically using their assets to basically help the Nazis in various ways. The FBI was created by a Bonaparte. The CIA, which was originally the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was founded by Bill Donovan, which is also a Knight of Malta. Reinhard Gehlen which was a Knight of Malta, was awarded the Grand Cross of Merit, and he was called Hitler's super spy. He was flown to the United States and struck a deal with Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles to keep his entire spy network with the Nazis. But they were going to be funded by the CIA, which again was started by Knights of Malta, which eventually became the West German intelligence network. So the Nazis were very much supported by the Knights of Malta, by the Jesuit interests. Gellin himself modeled his network after the cell-based hierarchical structure of the Jesuit order also. So everybody took their notes from the Jesuits. Walther Rauff, which is an SS officer, invented the mobile gas van. He was instrumental in helping early Mossad get off the ground and training them. Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, ended up working with the Mossad and helping train their special ops. James Jesus Angleton, famous CIA counterintelligence chief and primary liaison to the Mossad, was also mentored by Bill Donovan and was instrumental in establishing the link between Mossad and the CIA. Again, there's two sides, folks. There's the dark and the light, the Rome and Judea, Jewish and Catholic side. You got to see this pattern. James Jesus Angleton worked closely with Reinhard Gellin and the Gellin organization, and together they formed the military-industrial complex that we see against the communist bloc after World War II. Operation Paperclip also brought about 1,600 Nazis into the United States and created NASA, among many other things. All of this was managed by the OSS CIA funding so that these assets would perform what they wanted for the beast. In 1946, you had the famous occult event with Jack Parsons, who started JPL Laboratories, L. Ron Hubbard, who was in Scientology, and Aleister Crowley, who was a famous Satanist. JPL was the backbone of NASA's rocketry, and Jack Parsons was heavily involved in Aleister Crowley's Ordo Templi Orientis secret society. Aleister Crowley claimed this order goes back to the Knights Templar, so he built his whole structure off the Knights Templar also. Aleister Crowley also had very interesting Catholic and Jesuit connections, which I discuss in my Synagogue of Satan series. He worked for the MI6 during the wars, so he was part of the intelligence system. The beast title that he chose to use was very deliberate, and that was so that it would work with everything else to take attention off the real papacy, because at the time, remember, at the time, what you had? You had all the KKK, you had dispensationalism, you had all of these things happening to take attention off the beast and change people's perception of who the Antichrist power on the earth was. In parallel with all of these shenanigans happening, so that people wouldn't be paying attention to popery and to papism and Romanism. So this whole beast title that Aleister Crowley chose is no different than all of the obviously evil stuff you see in Hollywood, or the Satanists parading around in Washington D.C. or whatever. This is obviously evil, low-hanging fruit, designed to make people think like, oh, maybe the Antichrist is a real person, not a systemic Antichrist. So anyway, Aleister Crowley also goes back to the Plymouth Brethren, which is the same place Darby came out of. So they're all peas in a pod. You also have the creation of the State of Israel, which was accomplished by the Rothschilds and the Nazi interests, which I've talked about quite a bit. Nevertheless, the State of Israel is just a final papal crusade in the Middle East to destroy Protestants, Muslims, and Jews all in one go. If you want to know how that works, watch my Venerable Day of the Sun, number 24. You also have the Operation Mockingbird to control the media. And that was, there's a famous quote by William J. Casey, CIA director between 1981 and 1987. It goes something like this. We will know our disinformation campaign is complete when everything that the American public believes is false. Now, this particular quote comes from Barbara Honegger, who was a former policy researcher for the Reagan administration. Whether it's true or not, you can be the decider of that. However, William Casey was a high-ranking Knight of Malta. He graduated from Jesuit Fordham University. And of course, today that mission is accomplished. So if he said that or not, that's exactly what happened. And he's also part of the club. The conservative echo chamber in today, Nick Fuentes, Candace Owens, et cetera, all these people, predominantly the conservative echo chamber has become Catholic. And I've documented that also as well. Of course, with the AI technology out in the world, the citizen journalist is all but completely discredited, and that's all by design. So you can't trust anything you see. And this is why we need the Bible. We need the Bible, we need history, and we need patience. Because when they pull these psyops, we just need to watch. And we need to watch with Bible and history in both of our hands. And as long as we have that, Bible, history, and patience, that trifecta is going to always give you the truth. You may not know the complete truth, and it doesn't matter, but we know the truth, and that's what matters. So, conclusion. World War II was a staged conflict, just like practically every conflict since the French Revolution, and it served the beast agenda with the rise of the globalist world order afterward. The rise of the State of Israel, the rise of the military-industrial complex, and the rise of NASA. All of these things were necessary structures for the beast to continue its subjugation of the United States and eventually the world. All of these set also the stage for the 20th century for America to wreak havoc on the world through operations, revolutions, installing central banks, subjugating more and more people to the papal system, and so on. Today, that agenda is practically accomplished, so America is going to be drawing back, like I said, from being the sword in the world and policing the world to being more of the light in the world, the light of the papacy in the world, because America is going to go through its own transfiguration here shortly, and eventually they will share the truth of Catholic social teaching with the rest of the world. Now, that takes us to the late 20th century, which is after World War II. After the big war and the world order was rearranged, many more important things happened in American history. Culture shaping and non-governmental organizations like the John Birch Society, the Heritage Foundation were created post-war as conservative think tanks and oppositions to the communist liberal agenda, because of course they always have to have a dialectic. These were hotbeds for Knights of Malta and Jesuit operatives of the beast. They also spawned more and more organizations like the Moral Majority, Family Research Council, Council for National Policy. Later you had the Tea Party movement, and then of course eventually you had TPUSA. So all of these things are related. They're all just leapfrog NGOs that are designed to launder money, to shape culture, and basically to do operations and have a state within a state. They're all related also because members within them are members of secret society of various orders, of Jesuitism, and so they all pay their homage to their God one way or another. They are also very highly ecumenical because things like the Moral Majority were made by Protestants and Catholics, and they united Protestants and Catholics together. Of course, some of these Protestants were probably Jesuit operatives, but the other ones were just fools because they had been deceived by then by the eschatology. They didn't see union with Catholics as a bad thing. And that just goes to show you how quickly, over the course of, 150, 200 years, deception has happened to where now the American thing for the Protestant was to team up with Rome against liberalism. Do you get it? Whereas like 200 years prior to that, an American teaming up with a Catholic was like totally un-American. Now the American thing was to team up with the Catholics against liberalism, which was the big bad boogeyman that was being raised up, which of course has its ecumenical consequences. Now, there's also Catherine Kuhlman, following Vatican II and the ecumenical agenda. You see a very different approach by Rome through flatteries, ecumenism, openness, of course, all the things that have been governing Rome's approach for the last 60 years. Of course, they could afford to do that by then because America had been subverted for a century more. So Catherine Kuhlman was a major figure in this regard because she was a Jesuit operative. She was meeting with Pope Paul VI in 1972, receiving his blessing. Her services were very ecumenical, full of false signs and wonders. She had many Catholic priests and nuns alongside Protestants in these areas, very, very highly spiritually delusional. She was the mentor of people like Benny Hinn, which was the next wave of Protestant slop, basically, with the prosperity gospel. Kuhlman was also one of many agents to promote ecumenism and the delusion through the charismatic movement of unifying under this, thing. However, Kuhlman's role was also to destroy Protestantism from another angle by adding to the delusion. Because again, everything that the devil does is designed to move the agenda in a direction, and then when he's ready, he cashes in that chip and destroys that narrative and proclaims himself the savior over it. So right now you're seeing the current pope is against speaking in tongues, which he should be because speaking in tongues is obviously stupid. So there's no speaking in tongues, folks. So this pope has drawn a line against speaking in tongues, meaning the people who are Pentecostal, charismatic, NAR, all these people have a clock on their heads. And all of that was by design to further discredit Protestantism. by destroying its eschatology with Jew-loving and destroying its soteriology, everything they do with all the speaking in tongues and obsession over the prosperity gospel and everything else. So people like Catherine Kuhlman, who were agents of the beast and very active in their ministries, quote unquote, if you can even call it that, ministry of Satan, were designed to shape culture, to bring ecumenism, and to also destroy Protestantism. So that once Protestantism was sufficiently shaped and delusional, then ecumenism would be very effective and these people could be exposed and all of them would just convert to Catholicism and realize their error. And that's the point. That's the point. Today you have people like Paula White, who's put on display for you in the Office of Religious Liberty, or whatever it's called, and she's Kundalini, yada yada, bula bala, bila bila bala.
I hear a sound of an abundance of rain. I hear a sound of victory. The Lord says it is done. The Lord says it is done.
Where I walk, God walks, these kinds of things. Just stupid things, but this is all by design. Do you get it? She's put in front so you can see and marvel at how stupid she is. And then say, gosh, these Protestants are dumb. And that's exactly the point. So this is how far we've come. And people like Catherine Kuhlman were very early on pioneers of that delusion, taking other things before them like Irving and other Pentecostal, false prophets and weaponizing them to create more and more delusion. Now let's talk about Mother Theresa. Gosh, there's so much to talk about. Mother Theresa was a cultural icon. She was designed to hide the Roman Catholic Church greed for gain and power and hide all of the shenanigans that were happening behind noble intentions. She was involved with many money laundering and trafficking schemes. Charles Keating, who was a fraudster involved in the Lincoln Savings Loan scandal, donated about $1.25 million to her cause, and she pleaded to have the judge give him leniency in his fraud case. And of course, when the prosecutor told Mother Teresa that the funds she received were stolen, she did nothing about it, and the funds were never recovered. She was also involved with Robert Maxwell, that's right, Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, and the Haitian dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier, as well as the Vatican Bank, funneling money and trafficked children through all sorts of schemes. In 2018, after her death, a nun and social worker in India working for Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity were arrested for selling infants for thousands of dollars. These black market sales were, of course, going on for who knows how long, but they were very common. Mother Teresa was also a mind controller. She was shaping culture and indoctrinating the poor and unfortunate that, quote, suffering is beautiful. It's beautiful that you're suffering, and she's indoctrinating these people to continue in their situations and embrace the status quo so that people wouldn't revolt against the injustices that were being done to them. So she was a very, very evil and despicable individual. Despite her charity receiving tons of money and being the 10th wealthiest in India of the charities, her clinics were always unhygienic and just dilapidated, and they were using the same needles to re-inject people and providing zero pain relief. It was just despicable. So Mother Teresa is definitely not who people think she is. She was an agent of the beast and a very wicked woman. And this is just one of many examples, folks. Today, recently, you have things like Catholic Charities as another recent example of major money laundering. In 2025, the DHS suspended federal funding for Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley because they found at least 248 instances of billing for services outside mandated windows and beyond legal eligibility. So they were billing insurance and billing, different things that they weren't supposed to be doing, as of typical with these things. As of 2025, Catholic Charities and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, are under investigation by the U.S. House of Representatives for how they manage funds for migrant aid, because they have been laundering money through these immigration schemes for who knows how long. Of course, I don't expect that to ever pan out to anything, but what do you expect? Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has accused many of these organizations as facilitating human smuggling and laundering money. These organizations together get billions of dollars in taxpayer benefits, and they get that funneled to them through all sorts of means where you can't track anything because they're moving the money around, and you can't really get ahead of what's happening, and they're not financially transparent. They always appeal to noble intentions and, God and the church and everything else and the gospel and helping the poor and putting it as a shield for all their nefarious activities. So nothing new under the sun, folks. Whether it was the Jesuits with their reductions or Maryland or whatever else, or it's today with Catholic Charities and U.S. CCB. It's nothing new under the sun. The devil appears as an angel of light. He appears as something good. That's the pattern, okay? He appears as something good. And that means that the people who follow the devil will appear as something good. As Paul says, the end of time will come with the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. The power of God is the gospel. That's what Paul says in another place. So the appearance of godliness, having the appearance of godliness, except denying the gospel. What is that? Well, the only explanation for that is something that looks Christian, but it's not. In fact, it's satanic and evil. Now let's talk about JFK. Today, everyone is getting Jew-pilled and baited into believing the Mossad was practically behind every evil thing in history, which is not true, because history is much more nuanced and there are many arms to the devil. JFK was punished for rebelling against the Catholic Church and the Jesuit world order. His 1961 speech about secret societies and the military-industrial complex was a slap in the face at this world order, just like Monroe, like the Monroe Doctrine, 100 years before him. The only difference and the problem for JFK was that by that point in time, America was already well subverted, okay? And the technology to kill you had advanced very far in 100 years. With Monroe, they still killed him, but, it was different. America wasn't as subjugated. With JFK, very, very subjugated. In a previous year, in 1960, JFK reassured a group of Protestant ministers in one of his speeches that he's not going to take orders from the Pope. Listen, I'm Catholic, but I'm not taking orders from the Pope. So that sealed his fate. And of course, if you are with me up until this point in time, you should understand that Mossad was not the only agency behind JFK, the JFK assassination. JFK's intent to split the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the wind was a direct threat to the Knights of Malta military-industrial Catholic complex that had been already set up for 30 plus years by that time. By opposing these operations and opposing the agencies of the beast, JFK was opposing the illicit financial arm of the scheme, the shadow New World Order of the beast through secret societies and the drug trades and everything else. So he was against this military-industrial complex, okay? He was against it. And that's a real problem, especially for the fact that by that point in time, America had already been subjugated. Lee Harvey Oswald gave a 30-minute lecture to a group of Jesuits in Mobile, Alabama. His cousin, Eugene Murrett, was in formation to become a Jesuit priest. This was not random at all, but rather a quote-unquote briefing or probably likely an intelligence check conducted by the order before everything was happening. So the Jesuits had their paw prints all over it, but of course the Jesuits are never going to be up front doing it. They're going to have proxies and other people. Remember that the Knights of Malta and the Mossad were connected like two peas in a pod. So if JFK is threatening to dismantle the CIA, do you think the Mossad is not going to be involved when this is all just one satanic complex? But of course everybody thinks that the Jews did 9/11, the Jews did JFK, the Jews did everything. But it's not so cut and dry, my friends. Remember Christopher Columbus. Papal court Jews are always put forward to take the blame. Today, everyone thinks that Israel killed JFK, but it's a lot more nuanced than that. If people aren't talking to you about the Jesuits, the Knights of Malta, the Catholic interests, the Vatican Bank, all these different things, then they're omitting to you a very significant portion of the truth. Very, very significant. Remember all the crossover between Rome and Judea throughout time. If you need a refresher, we'll go watch my video, Rome and Judea are united against Christ. JFK was a liberal Catholic that wanted to restore the American Republic. So he was punished for his disobedience to the papacy and made to be an example to all presidents going forward. Just in case you thought that America had a chance of being a republic again, think again. And every president after that knew exactly what happened to JFK. So they played ball. That's why every president you get is a puppet. Nobody comes into this position elected. They are selected. Especially after the Civil War, when America was subjugated, nobody comes into this position. Prior to the Civil War, people were elected. Okay? That's true. They were elected. They were generally fairly elected. However, they were also assassinated, and they didn't live too long, or they were attempted to be assassinated. So, you have to learn these things and tell others these historical truths, because people think that voting is how you beat the devil. We have to just vote differently this time, guys, which is, of course, total nonsense. So JFK wanted to restore the Republic, and he was punished. And that was a statement by the Jesuits that they controlled the office of the presidency and that nobody better be misbehaving, just like they did with the Pope. The Jesuits assassinated their own Pope. So that means that they're not above anything. And then, of course, the Pope played along, and today you have a Pope, you have a white Pope and a black Pope. And the mission is still to get the Pope to be marveled at. But the Pope is not like willy-nilly doing his own thing. He has his army, and they submit to him. But if you've read the Art of War, sometimes they submit, sometimes they don't, if it serves the agenda. But ultimately, their agenda is to get one man to be worshipped and marveled as the presence of God on earth. Now, let's talk about environmentalism. Because of the Jesuit Georges Lemaitre, Operation Paperclip, CIA OSS, NASA, etc., all of this was able to be eventually established, and NASA was able to deceive people with the world and people in general with the moon landing. This spawned the environmentalist movement through Earthrise and the propaganda of astronauts in space and a blue dot in space and so on. Around that time, the Club of Rome also published its paper Limits to Growth and began the overpopulation narrative. And for a good 50 or so years, the climate agenda afterward was woven into the liberal paradigm. And it became a liberal issue. So you can thank Rome for the climate change agenda, but now that agenda has become a moral and ecumenical issue. As of Pope Francis and his Laudato Si ecumenical teaching, encyclical is what I meant to say, climate change is now part of the Catholic social teaching narrative. So climate change has become a moral issue, and it's also tied into Sunday rest and Sunday for the environment. So the future will see a rallying around Sunday as sacred for the family, sacred for society, and sacred for the planet. All thanks to Rome's agents. So when you see these kinds of things, you can thank Rome for that. Liberalism. Many Jesuits were highly influential in the development of liberalism in the last 80 years. But remember that Jesuits are also loyal to the papacy, so they just play their part wherever they need to play. They don't actually believe these things, they just do them for dialectical purposes. James Martin, S.J., one of the most vocal LGBTQ activists, he wrote a book in 2017 called Building a Bridge, which was a major move for progressive Catholicism. Pedro Arrupe, S.J., a former superior general, shifted the focus toward leftist, Marxist ideologies like liberation theology and social justice. John Sobrino, S.J., major proponent of liberation theology and social justice theology. Pope Francis, S.J., of course, highly liberal and served to only add fuel for the liberal Catholics and liberal Christians and ecumenism. Georgetown, Fordham, other universities programmed the liberal agenda. And of course, remember that J.P. Morgan, the Rothschild, etc., and the banking interests were highly incentivized and involved with the rise of feminism because they wanted more people to pay taxes and have debt and things like that so they could own more and more of the slice. Today, the liberal narrative has been reined in and destroyed because it served its purpose. It served its purpose to terrorize the people and to destroy everything so that now there's a justification to return to religion and nationalism. Liberalism was designed to push people toward a particular direction so that they would rebound and go into religion, and specifically Catholicism as the solution, the Catholic social teaching. The left itself has been totally discredited as of Biden, and they're coming back to center now to embrace morality and religion because that's what they need. And of course, the right is also being discredited via Trump. Trump is basically Biden 2.0. And the right is going to come back because they already have religion on the right, but they're going to come back to social justice. And they're going to get rid of the Judaizing, dispensational kind of religious views. They're going to come back to a more Catholic view and a social justice view. So what do you see? You see Rome on both sides, as usual. Now, the 1970s had a lot of crises. 1970s were filled with the typical shenanigans, and we need to talk about them. Of course, the Vietnam War raged on for many reasons, but most people don't realize that the CIA and the Catholic military-industrial complex was highly involved with that situation. The CIA's drug cartel relationships and worldwide network of drug money was implicated. It was also called Spellman's War, named after Cardinal Francis Spellman, the Archbishop of New York, and a highly important Knight of Malta member. He was very supportive of Ngo Dinh Diem, which was the Catholic president of South Vietnam. And the Jesuits wanted to get a Catholic foothold in Asia, so this was a very important situation where they had to use their sword, which was America, to gain this foothold. If you know the history of the Jesuits in Asia, they've always wanted to conquer it. They've always wanted to have a foothold there. They were executed and expelled. They were executed and expelled from Japan as early as the 1600s. And of course, The Hiroshima and Nagasaki events were payment to Japan for their execution of these various Jesuits. But the Japanese knew what they were doing. War also created Crises to justify yet another banking scheme. And of course, the banking scheme was to take the dollar off of the gold standard and to highly leverage the United States into even more borrowing and more wars and so on and so forth. So the war in Vietnam served many purposes for the beast. And Nixon did his part to remove the dollar off the gold standard as a result of this crisis, because we need liquidity, and begin the petrodollar, which accelerated American globalism, especially in the Middle East. It accelerated the military-industrial complex because now you don't have limitations. You can borrow as much as you want. And stealing wealth from the middle class in the process through inflation and stock market schemes, as well as setting into motion the eventual collapse of the monetary system, which is the paper monetary system, the paper fiat, which is worthless. A dollar from today is 99% less valuable than it was 100 years ago. But this was all by design, folks. This highly leveraged system that we've been in since the 1970s was all by design because they understand that the final system has to be based on something. And in order to do that, you have to have an order out of chaos situation, which is what's happening now. The economic system collapsing now is a result of what happened in the 1970s, of pushing this system into a completely unbacked smoke and mirrors system that's backed literally based on violence and conflict, which is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. It's not based on anything. It's not based on gold. It's not based on real assets. And of course, my feeling is that they'll probably will transition to some kind of gold-backed system and see that as a solution. Now we have a solution now, and everybody has to participate. Just sign your name on the dotted line, that kind of thing. So it'll be a solution, and it'll seem very good. But the point is that this was designed eventually also to make the monetary system collapse so that they could, when it runs into the ground, they could introduce the new financial system that will give them the opportunity to control everybody's purchasing, which is what you see now. John McLaughlin, Jesuit, was Nixon's top aide and speechwriter, and another Jesuit, Robert Drinan, was leading the impeachment efforts during Watergate. So you have the typical both sides of the dialectic controlled by the Jesuits. Alexander Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, was also a Knight of Malta. So you had Catholic interests all over the presidency. Henry Kissinger, who everyone knows by now and has used as a poster boy for the evil, scheming Jew, rubbing his hands, was actually knighted, an honorary knight commander of the Order of St. Michael and George by Queen Elizabeth. He worked closely with Knights of Malta members like Alexander Haig and James Jesus Angleton. He was a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. He was an advisor to many popes. And he was awarded an honorary award by the Republic of Malta in 2009. So you tell me, what do you think? Is Henry Kissinger just a scheming Zionist Jew trying to kill the Christians, or is he a papal court Jew because Rome and Judea are united against Christ? Now, the Vatican Bank scandal also happened around that time, with Nixon around, a little bit after, around the time the U.S. stock market lost about 50% in its value yet again. And of course, with more manipulation and manufactured crises. During this window, 1973 to 1974, you had the Vatican's financial advisor, Michel Sindona, presided over the collapse of the Franklin National Bank scandal. In 1973, the U.S. Justice Department investigated the Vatican Bank for allegedly participating in a $950 million counterfeit security scheme involving the mafia and Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who would be part of the 1987 stock market crash later, and no action was taken, and he got away. So keep that in mind. $950 million in 1973 was a lot of money. It's still a lot of money today, but it was even more money back then. Sexual abuse. The RCC has abused countless children over the course of the last 120 years, of course, over the last 2,000 years, but with many independent investigators confirming a massive pattern that is consistent with everything that we have looked at. Massive, massive pattern. And what is that pattern? Well, France. You have the CIASE report in 2021. An independent commission estimated that 216,000 children were sexually abused by Catholic clergy since 1950. That's only a matter of 70 years. When including lay members and volunteers, the figure rises to approximately 330,000 victims. In Spain, the Ombudsman report in 2023 A national human rights investigation estimated that over 200,000 children were abused by Catholic clergy, with a broader survey suggesting that up to 440,000 people reported abuse by someone associated with the church. United States, the John Jay Report, 2004 and 2011, the Church Commissioned study identified nearly 11,000 allegations against 4,392 priests, roughly 4% of all priests, between 1950 and 2001. Later reports have identified over 18,500 victims and more than 6,700 accused priests in the U.S. alone. Now, this was a church commission study, so they're very motivated to fudge the numbers as usual, but I'm sure there's way more than that, given the size of the influence of the Catholic Church in America and the population. Australia, the Royal Commission in 2017 found that 7% of the priests were alleged perpetrators between 1950 and 2010, involving tens of thousands of children across Catholic-run institutions. Investigations in Ireland, like the Ryan and Murphy reports in Germany in the MHG study, confirmed that the hierarchy practiced obsessive concealment for decades. So other countries have confirmed what I just told you, which is that they practiced obsessive concealment. They used all sorts of legal shenanigans they could to conceal these problems by shifting people around, laundering money, changing records, all kinds of things, which of course prioritized the reputation of the Catholic Church over the safety of the children. 41 Catholic dioceses have still not released lists of credibly accused priests as of 2020. So in the United States, 41 Catholic dioceses have still not released any lists of their accused priests. In 1993, a sociologist and priest, Father Andrew Greeley, estimated that at least 100,000 children had been abused by Catholic clergy in the U.S. by that time. Modern advocates from organizations like bishopaccountability.org suggest that that settled claims represent only a tiny fraction of actual incidents, as most victims never come forward due to trauma, shame, or expired statutes of limitations. Yeah, how many more are there on top of the ones that we've already discovered? Recent look back laws in the states like California and New York have led to thousands of new historic claims being filed decades after the abuse occurred. For example, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles alone recently agreed to pay $880 million to settle claims for 1,353 survivors, many of whom were abused more than 50 years ago. Total payouts for settlements, legal fees, and victim compensation by the U.S. diocese have exceeded $5 billion since the scandal broke nationally in 2002. That's only 20 years ago, my friends. But it's okay. They have plenty of laundering that they've done, and they have way more money to spend, so they can handle it. It's just like JP Morgan. They manipulate the market for like billions of dollars, and they get a fine for $900 million. Like, okay, they made a profit. Who cares? Same thing with the vaccine companies too. They basically manipulate Congress into giving them immunity, and they make billions and billions of dollars. And of course, they get billions of dollars worth of fees and fines from lawsuits. They have a whole fund they have to pay. It's called the VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or something like that. And of course, there's a fund that pays out people. But they've made so much money, it doesn't matter. That's just the cost of doing business to them. It doesn't matter. Now, 1987 stock market crash. The 1980s were some of the most explosive financial scandals in papal history. Vatican Bank and Banco Ambrosiano had a scandal in 1982 to 1987. It was a giant money laundering scheme with Pope John Paul II. The Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who was the head of the Vatican Bank at that time, if you remember him from the scandal in the 70s, was accused of being an accessory to fraudulent bankruptcy. But he evaded arrest by staying where? At the Vatican City until 1991. And this is exactly why these priests, quote unquote, and I say them in big quotation marks, are actually political agents. This is exactly the perfect example of why these people are political agents. They're not priests. And that's why a Catholic can never be a true patriot, because they can only get extradited to their foreign country where they are actually a member of, because they are agents of an empire, and they can avoid responsibility. But don't worry, God saw it all, so he's not going to avoid responsibility. He's only avoiding it temporarily. The Vatican Bank paid creditors $224 million, but they denied liability. So they had kind of a settlement going on, but nevertheless, I'm sure they had way more profited from that anyway. In 1985, Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict the 16th? Yeah, the 16th. Pope Benedict the 16th published a paper called Market Economy and Ethics, warning that a decline in moral discipline, i.e. obedience to the church, would cause the market to collapse. Now, just like you had with Jacob Schiff and the Panic of 1907, what happened after that? 2 years later, that's exactly what happened. So they had a massive crash, just like 1929, just like 1907, just like the 70s, and that basically created more centralization as a result of the wake of the crash, transferring assets from the middle class to the wealthy, and moving people closer and closer to a digital system. They already have all the money and power. Now it's just a matter of shaping the culture and crashing the system to implement the new system. Now, as of the Iran war, that crash has already begun, and the entire world is implicated, and they're ready to involve this new system because the old system has come to an end. There's only so much you can do on an overly leveraged smoke and mirrors paper system. That system that happened in the 70s was never intended to be the final system. They know that. They're not stupid. But it was intended to create an imbalance, to highly leverage America so that it could accomplish all of these worldwide goals, while at the same time destroy America and reinvent it, which is exactly what you're seeing now, and destroy the world as a result, because all the world's money supply was tied to America. Do you get it? This highly leveraged system that they created in the 70s, with the US petrodollar and everybody having dollars, implicated the entire world in America. And of course, that system is based on smoke and mirrors, and that is now collapsing. So that means the world system now has a pretext, as a context, as a reason to be re-identified and to be restructured financially. And that was the entire plan. Now, Roberto Calvi, chairman of the Banco Ambrosiano, was part of the P2 Masonic Lodge. And Calvi was also found hung under the London Blackfriars Bridge in 1982, which was a typical Masonic execution and a sign to the people around him, just like everything else. These things helped sweep under the rug the true puppet masters and the involvement of the Vatican with the mafia and the Freemasonry, because they're all peas in the pod. Now, let's talk about wars and crusades. There's the Gulf War, there's Kosovo, etc. All these different wars and conflicts were exercised to bring Rome's sword into the world and to subjugate governments and to destabilize situations. The Gulf War strengthened the petrodollar and ensured long-term presence of the United States in the Middle East to destabilize, which is what we're seeing now being undone, because they're moving backwards, they're moving out of that. The Middle East has to be prepared for peace and delusion, so they have to collapse that narrative. Kosovo was initiated by a Jesuit graduate, Bill Clinton, and bombed the heck out of the Orthodox Serbs to reduce their influence in that area. And of course, by supporting Kosovo's independence, which is mostly Muslim but also growing Catholic minority, they partitioned a foothold of the Roman beast into the Orthodox stronghold. Today, the Orthodox Church is ready to reunite with their mother through dialogue, and after all the damage that has been done to them. After splitting, the Crusaders raped and pillaged the Byzantine Empire as punishment for their schism. Communism, also a Jesuit invention, and pushed into Russia and Ukraine by Jesuit interests. Of course, Jews were there also, but this was a Jesuit operation to punish the Orthodox for their schism from Mother Church. And Russia and Ukraine were definitely brutally punished with the Holodomor. Something like 11 million people were killed. Kosovo, similar, same thing. All these similar conflicts. Greece is bankrupt. Ukraine and Russia today are slaughtering each other. All of these dialectics are designed to destabilize the Orthodox and tenderize it, making reunion preferable with the beast, so that there's peace, so that there's protection, and so on and so forth. And since the 1970s, the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church have lifted the mutual excommunication that was in 1054. I forget what year it was, but it was, the Pope Paul VI or whatever his name was, meeting with the ecumenical patriarch at the time, Athanasius or whatever his name was, and they mutually lifted the excommunication, which was a major, major move. And of course, from that until last year in 2025, when you had the Pope and the ecumenical patriarch basically frolicking around, holding hands, singing Kumbaya at the Nicene Council, 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Council. Huge, huge move. And it's just a matter of time, folks. Just a matter of time. You also had the dot-com bubble, of course. You had another market crash technology bubble. Now, most people don't realize that the technology for the hypertext for the internet was invented by a Jesuit, Roberto Busa, who worked with IBM's Thomas Watson very early on in the 1940s and 1950s. So the internet was their idea. as was Bitcoin, and all of these were created around that time in the early 1990s. It falls into Teilhard de Chardin's omega point singularity idea, which is really just the image of the beast, and it will fulfill their goal to have a universal monetary system that controls everyone. So the internet was all by design to get everybody to be controlled. But just like 1929, just like 1970s, like the 1987 crash, this was yet another wealth transfer using the same mechanisms: insider trading, rigging the market, getting retail to hold the bag at the end with market hyping, saying one thing while doing another through the news and everything else. And then, of course, transferring more and more assets and wealth to controlled institutions, secret societies, Jesuits, influencers, NGOs, banks, and so on and so forth. 9/11 also happened around that time. Of course, today, most everyone has realized that 9/11 was an inside job. But by who and for what purpose is another story. Most people have not realized that. Everyone blames the Jews because that's the most obvious part. But you have to learn to see beyond the obvious. And hopefully I've given you enough history and context to see that. Louis Freeh, the FBI director right before Robert Mueller was appointed 1 week before 9/11, he was a Knight of Malta. The Patriot Act was written by Viet Din, a graduate of Georgetown University, and dismantled the remaining protections of the American people and the Constitution in the name of national security. 9/11 set the foundation to subvert the American people and create a police state that would eventually be loyal to the papacy, which of course is the image of the beast we are walking right into, and which we are soon seeing here. They also laundered $2.3 trillion from the Pentagon, which was announced a day beforehand by Donald Rumsfeld, yet more wealth transferred to the banking elite and cementing their power more and more. It was just like the other scams and shenanigans of the last 200 years. It was a crisis that allowed the centralization of power and laundering of money to increasingly increase more power and wealth and control for the elites. After 9/11, you had the DHS, and of course the DHS was funding millions to Catholic Charities over the last 20 years. They have now started to investigate them, but come on now, you tell me if anything's going to actually happen with that or not. So, final thoughts, my friends. You could have an entire series on all of these things and still have way more to talk about. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. If you are watching my videos, chances are you are aware of some of these things, or if you're old enough, you know what's happened in the last 20 years since then. So I'm not going to bother covering what happened after 9/11. I'm not going to do that because there's no point. Today, we are at the tail end of this narrative, and America is ready to perform its grand act of deception, its final act of obedience to the papacy, which is to fool the world. The Constitution has been destroyed, and it's meaningless. People want religion back, and they're willing to give up their rights for it. American politics have been totally discredited. Catholics seem like the rational ones. American Protestantism is dead. People are converting in droves to Catholicism because of Zionism and Dispensationalism. American middle class has been erased, demanding a social salvation which can only come from Catholic social teaching. Again, I believe in the next 5 years, you will see a resurrected Catholic Hollywood, a Catholic president, a Catholic cabinet, a Catholic majority over the evangelical majority, a Catholic Supreme Court, a Catholic conservative/patriotic echo chamber, a synthesis between right and left toward Catholic social teaching as the answer, and of course, an American Pope. America's 250-year anniversary, and gosh, I'm going to say this again. America's 250-year journey has come to an end. It's come to an end, and it is now going to fulfill its role to resurrect the papacy in the world. What are the odds that when all of these that I just listed, when all these things intersect, that the beast will enforce its morality through Sunday sacredness for the Eucharist, for the family, for the environment, for the good of society, etc., etc. What are the odds, folks? When all of these stars align, as the Bible told you so, what are the odds that all of these things will lead to an enforcement of morality? The odds are 100%. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And I think that when is right on the horizon. So learn your history and help others learn their history also. So what has Catholicism contributed to American history? Now that we've had plenty of context, the answer is nothing. Nothing but intrigue, death, financial ruin, and lies. Have they done anything positive? Yes, they have. But the biblical teaching is that God is the source of all good. God is the source of good works, and God also uses evil things for good. God can use anything, and he has used the Roman Catholic Church's institutions and efforts for great good and for great purposes. I went to a Catholic elementary school and a Jesuit high school, and it got me a free ride in college and a great education, for the most part. So God has a sense of humor because he sent me to a Jesuit school, but don't let the apologists take credit for the good that happens in society and give it to the Catholic Church, because the credit belongs to God. God is the one who causes people to do good works. God is the one who uses evil, even the blasphemy of Satan and the schemes of his agents, for great good. So God is the source of the good in the world, not institutions. If you believe the lie of free will, that we are the ones who generate the good, which is what the Catholic Church teaches, then the Catholic Church can always hide behind free will and say, well, look, the Catholic Church means well, there's always going to be bad actors because of sin, and that's just free will. No, it's not. There's no such thing as free will. There's prophecy, and there's what God has predestined, and God is the main actor in the history that determines whether something is good or not. So don't let them hide behind free will. The Catholic Church is an appointed system for Satan to continue his fifth and final iteration of his kingdom. And it operates in broad daylight as the kingdom of God. But it is a counterfeit kingdom. It is a counterfeit kingdom, and most of the world doesn't see it. Now, God can use that counterfeit kingdom for great good, in spite of Satan's activities, which is why God is sovereign. But nevertheless, it is God who did the good through Satan's empire on earth and used these things for the good for his purposes. Everything else, he left them be, let them to themselves. So God has done good through it, but the good that the Roman Catholic Church has done pales in comparison to the evil that it has done throughout time. It pales in comparison. So in your discussions with people, remind them of the 4 following critical points. Number 1, God is the source of good, and God has used pagan empires for good in the past. That doesn't make the Roman Catholic Church inherently good, because it is the 5th and final empire of Satan on earth. Number 2, the Roman Catholic Church has been a net negative contribution to American history, constantly subverting it through her agents and her schemes. Number 3, the Bible said that this would happen because America's role is to help the papacy resurrect. Number 4, history is nuanced and it is full of shadowy interests and organizations because the papacy always uses proxies to accomplish its purpose. And the Jews are just put as scapegoats for people to blame because they're the obvious Antichrist. So I hope that you learned something new today, my friends. I hope that you will share what you've learned with those around you. Pretty soon, they will accomplish the unthinkable to the founding fathers of this country to make the true meaning of American politics and American patriotism Catholic, which if Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or any of those people would be alive today, they would have a heart attack and die again. In other words, they're going to reframe this entire reality of the Catholic political sphere, I'm sure the American political sphere, to be such that to be Catholic is to be a patriot, and to be a patriot is to be Catholic. To be Catholic is to be a patriot, and to be a patriot means to be a Catholic. This is the redefinition that is happening over people's eyes in light of all the destruction that has been engineered. At that point, the inversion is going to be complete, and it will be time for the final phase, which will be the enforcing of the mark little by little until it gets a maximum. And then at some point, when that maximum hits, the iniquities have reached their height and the bowl judgments will drop. So make sure that you come out of Babylon before then. So stay sharp, stay smart, and don't let the snakes get to you. We'll see you next time. Take care, and God bless.